The wind out here did not just blow, it hunted. It scoured the high plains of Wyoming with a rasping, relentless hunger, stripping the bark from the sagebrush and the hope from anyone foolish enough to try and put down roots in the alkali soil. Ada felt it chewing at the exposed skin of her face, finding the raw places where her tears had dried hours ago and stinging them fresh. She kept her head down, chin tucked into the collar of a coat that was too big for her, a rough wool garment she had stolen from a peg in the barn on her way out. Beneath her, the sway-backed mule plodded forward with the grim resignation of a creature that had given up on better days long before she had. Its hooves struck the hard-pan earth with a dull, rhythmic clatter that echoed in the vast, white silence of the afternoon. There was no color in this world. The sky was a bleached sheet of tin. The grass was the color of old bone, and the horizon was a flat, unforgiving line that seemed to stretch on forever without offering a single place to hide. Perdition Creek appeared out of the dust like a scar on the land. It was not much of a town, just 2 rows of warped wooden buildings facing each other across a wide, rutted street that was more mud than dirt this time of year. The railroad had promised to come through here 5 years ago, but the surveyors had taken one look at the dry creek bed and the howling emptiness and turned their tracks south. Now, the town was dying by inches, its paint peeling like sunburned skin, its windows clouded with the grit that never settled. Ada pulled on the mule's reins, her hands stiff inside leather gloves that were worn through at the thumbs. Every muscle in her body ached. She had been riding for 3 days, stopping only when the mule refused to take another step, or when the fear in her chest became so heavy she had to slide down and vomit into the dry grass. As the buildings loomed closer, the memory she had been holding at bay with every ounce of her will surged forward. It did not come as a whole picture, but in jagged, terrifying shards. The smell of expensive cigar smoke and stale whiskey, the heavy, polished oak of a ranch office door slamming shut, the sound of a lock turning. Ada squeezed her eyes shut, her breath hitching in a sob she refused to let out. Silas Brandt, his face red and sweating, the way he had smiled, not with kindness, but with ownership. "You think you are too good for this, Ada? You are nothing without me, just a pauper living on my charity." She could still feel the phantom grip of his hands on her shoulders, heavy and immovable as iron. She remembered the sound of her dress tearing, the sharp, sickening rip of fabric at her shoulder. She remembered the weight of him, the suffocating terror, and the voice that hissed in her ear while she fought like a trapped bird. "You tell anyone, and I will ruin you. I will paint you as a whore from here to Cheyenne. Who will they believe? Ada? The cattle baron who owns the bank? Or the little charity case who seduced him?" She shuddered, the sensation of the mule's bony spine beneath her bringing her back to the cold reality of the present. She was not in that office anymore. She was in Perdition Creek, and she was alone, but the shame traveled with her. It sat on the saddle behind her, heavy as a sack of grain. She guided the mule toward a building that looked slightly less dilapidated than the others. A hand-painted sign swung on a rusty chain above the porch. Webb's Boarding House. Vacancy. Ada slid off the mule, her legs nearly buckling as her boots hit the ground. She had to grab the hitching post to stay upright. The wood was rough against her palms. She took a moment to steady herself, brushing the thickest layer of dust from her skirts. She touched her hair, trying to smooth the tangled mess back into some semblance of order, but she knew it was hopeless. She looked exactly what she was, a woman running for her life. She climbed the steps and pushed open the door. The air inside was still and smelled of boiled cabbage and lye soap. A woman stood behind a high wooden counter, sorting through a stack of mail. She was tall and thin, with gray hair pulled back so tight it pulled the corners of her eyes into a permanent squint. The woman looked up. Her gaze started at Ada's dusty boots, traveled up the stained hem of her skirt, lingered on the ill-fitting man's coat, and finally settled on her face. Ada saw the woman's eyes narrow as they locked onto the faint, yellowing bruise on her jawline and the darker marks fading at her throat. "I need a room," Ada said. Her voice sounded rusty, unused. "Just for a few nights." The woman, Mrs. Webb did not smile. She placed a letter down on the counter with a deliberate slap. "We run a respectable house here," she said. Her voice was flat, hard as a river stone. "We do not have traffic with drifters or women of low character." Ada felt the heat rise in her cheeks, burning beneath the layer of dust. "I have money," she said, reaching into her pocket for the small, knotted handkerchief where she kept the few coins she had managed to steal from Silas's desk before she fled. "I can pay, Mrs." Webb looked at the coins in Ada's hand, then back at the bruises on her neck. Her expression shifted from suspicion to a cold, predatory calculation. She knew desperation when she saw it. $3 a week, Mrs., Webb said, in advance, and no guests in the room, male or female. $3? Ada whispered. It was robbery. A room like this, in a town like this, should cost $1, maybe less. That is very high, Mrs. Webb shrugged, picking up her mail again. "That is the price for a woman traveling alone with no baggage and a face that looks like it has been in a brawl. You want the room or not?" Ada looked at the coins in her hand. If she paid $3, she would have almost nothing left for food, but the wind outside was howling, and the thought of sleeping in the open, exposed to the cold and the men who drifted through these parts, made her stomach turn over. "I will take it," Ada said softly. She counted out the silver dollars and slid them across the counter. "Mrs." Webb swept the money into a drawer without a word and dropped a heavy iron key on the wood. "Room 4, upstairs, end of the hall. Dinner is at 6. If you are late, you do not eat." Ada took the key. It felt cold in her hand. "Thank you." "Do not thank me, Mrs., Webb said, not looking up. "Just keep your door locked and your business to yourself." An hour later, Ada forced herself to go back out into the wind. She had washed the worst of the grit from her face in the cracked ceramic basin in her room, flinching as the cold water touched the raw skin on her neck. She needed food, and she needed to find someone who would stable the mule for a few cents. The main street of Perdition Creek was busier now. Cowboys from the surrounding ranches had ridden in for supplies or to spend their pay at the saloon down the block. Horses stood hip-shot at the hitching rails, their tails flicking at flies that were too frozen to bite. Ada kept her head down, walking close to the storefronts to stay out of the wind. She felt eyes on her. Men stopped their conversations to watch her pass, their gazes heavy and speculating. In the city, a woman walking alone was ignored. Here, she was a curiosity, a target. She was passing the boardwalk in front of the barber shop when the door swung open and a man stumbled out. He was big, smelling of stale beer and unwashed wool. He nearly collided with her, and Ada gasped, stepping back quickly. The man blinked, his eyes unfocused and watery. He grinned, a loose, wet expression that made Ada's skin crawl. "Well, now," the man drawled, his voice slurring. "Look at what the wind blew in. You are a little dusty, darling, but I bet you clean up real nice." "Excuse me," Ada said, trying to step around him. He moved faster than she expected, his hands shooting out to grab her wrist. His fingers were thick and rough, clamping down hard enough to bruise. "Do not be in such a hurry," he said, pulling her closer. Ada could smell the whiskey on his breath, sharp and sour. "I got a silver dollar in my pocket that says you and me could have a fine time. What do you say?" "Let go of me," Ada said, her voice shaking. Panic flared in her chest, white-hot and blinding. It was happening again, the trap, the helplessness. The man laughed, leaning down. "I like a little spirit. Makes the breaking more fun." Ada pulled back, her boots slipping on the boardwalk. She opened her mouth to scream, but her throat closed up. Terror paralyzed her. She stared at the man's red, sweating face, and for a second, it blurred into the face of Silas Brandt. "I believe the lady asked you to let go." The voice was not loud. It was not a shout. It was quiet, flat, and cold as the bottom of a well. The drunk cowboy froze. He looked up, his grip on Ada's wrist loosening just a fraction. Standing 10 feet away, leaning casually against a support post of the boardwalk, was a man Ada had not seen before. He was tall and lean, wearing a duster coat that had seen better years and a hat pulled low over his eyes. His face was a map of hard living, sun lines deep around his mouth and a thin, jagged scar running from his cheekbone down into the shadow of his jaw. He was not holding a gun in his hand, but a Winchester rifle was slung over his shoulder, the metal worn smooth and dark. He stood with a stillness that was unnatural, like a coiled rattlesnake waiting for a reason to strike. The drunk blinked, trying to focus. "This ain't your business. Friend, we're just talking. You are holding her wrist," the stranger said. His voice did not change pitch. "She does not look like she wants to be held, so I'm going to tell you one time. Let go while you still can." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The drunk looked at the stranger, sizing him up. He looked at the rifle, then at the stranger's eyes. Whatever he saw there cut through the haze of alcohol. It was the look of a man who would pull a trigger and go back to his dinner without a second thought. The drunk muttered a curse and dropped Ada's hand as if it had turned hot. "You are crazy," he mumbled, backing away. "Just having some fun. No need to get riled." He turned and stumbled off down the street, looking back once over his shoulder before ducking into the nearest alley. Ada stood trembling, clutching her wrist against her chest. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the stranger, expecting him to come closer, expecting him to demand gratitude or payment like every other man seemed to want. But he didn't move. He just watched her for a moment, his eyes dark and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He looked at her shaking hands, then at her face. There was no pity in his expression, but there was no hunger either, just a quiet, measuring assessment. "Thank you," Ada whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. The man touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply pushed himself off the post and walked away, his boots making no sound on the wood. He disappeared into the crowd, leaving Ada standing alone in the wind. Later that afternoon, after she had bought a small loaf of bread and some cheese, Ada found herself near the livery stable at the edge of town. The wind had died down slightly, leaving a cold, eerie stillness over the plains. She saw him again. The stranger, Luke, she would later learn his name was Luke Carver, was standing in the corral next to the stable. He was working with a horse, a tall, skittish roan with a nasty scar on its flank that looked like a burn mark. The horse was rolling its eyes, stepping high and nervous, tossing its head every time Luke moved. Ada stopped behind the corner of the stable, watching. She expected violence. That was the way of things here. If a horse would not listen, you broke it. If a woman would not listen, you broke her. But Luke did not raise his voice. He did not raise a hand. He stood near the horse's shoulder, one hand resting lightly on the animal's withers, the other holding the lead rope with plenty of slack. He was talking to the horse, a low, steady stream of nonsense words that drifted on the air. "Easy now," he was saying. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Not today. You got fire in you. I see that. That is good. Keeps you alive. But you do not need to fight me." The horse snorted and sidestepped, its hooves kicking up dust. Luke moved with it, fluid as water, never tightening the rope, never losing contact. He stroked the horse's neck, his big, scarred hand gentle on the shivering hide. "I know," Luke murmured. "I know it hurts. We will get you sorted." Ada watched, mesmerized. It was impossible to reconcile this man with the one who had stood on the boardwalk with eyes like ice. She had heard whispers in the general store when he walked past earlier. 2 old men huddled by the stove had fallen silent, then whispered as he left. "That is Carver," one had said. "Keep clear of him. I heard he put a man in the ground down south, shot him dead in a dispute over a card game. He is bad news." Bad news. A killer. But as Ada watched, the roan horse lowered its head and blew a soft breath against Luke's chest. Luke scratched the animal behind the ears, his face softening into something that looked almost like peace. Ada stepped back, suddenly feeling like she was intruding on something private. She turned and hurried back toward the boarding house. the image of his gentle hands burning in her mind. The next 2 days were a slow, grinding lesson in humiliation. Ada needed work. The money she had stolen would not last 2 weeks at Mrs. Webb's rates. She washed her one good dress, mended the tear at the shoulder as best she could, and set out to find employment. She went to the general store first. The owner, a balding man with spectacles, listened to her request for work stocking shelves or counting inventory. He looked at her hands, soft, uncalloused hands of a woman who had been kept in a house, and then at her face. "I have no work for you," he said abruptly, turning his back. "My wife handles the front. We do not need help." She tried the seamstress shop. The bell tinkled cheerfully as she entered. The woman behind the counter was pinning a hem on a dress for a rancher's wife. Both women looked up. The silence that fell was thick and suffocating. "I am a good seamstress," Ada said, keeping her head high. "I can do embroidery. I can repair lace." The rancher's wife leaned over and whispered something to the seamstress. The seamstress sniffed. "We are full up," she said, not meeting Ada's eyes. "Try the laundry. Though I doubt they want someone's cast off ruining the linens." Cast off. The word hit Ada like a slap. They knew, or they thought they knew. In a town this small, a woman without a husband, arriving with bruises and no baggage, was only one thing. Ada walked out, her vision blurred with tears of rage. She walked past the church, past the schoolhouse. She felt the judgment pressing in on her from every window. She was spoiled. She was trash. By the third afternoon, she was desperate. She had $1 left. She stood in front of the saloon. It was called the Lucky Dollar, a cruel joke for a place that smelled of despair. The swinging doors were battered, and the sound of a tinny piano drifted out. Ada took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts, and walked in. The interior was dim and smoky. Men sat at tables, playing cards or nursing drinks. The bartender, a greasy, heavy-set man with oil in his hair and stains on his vest, looked up as she approached the bar. This was Harlan Pike. "Are you looking for company, sweetheart?" Pike asked, leaning his elbows on the polished wood. He grinned, revealing yellow teeth. "I am looking for work," Ada said. Her voice was steady, though her knees were shaking. "Cleaning, mending, anything you have." Pike looked her over. His gaze was physical, a slow crawl over her body that made Ada want to scrub her skin with lye. He looked at her waist, her hips, the curve of her neck. "Well," Pike said, dragging the word out, "I got girls who work upstairs. You could make good money, a pretty thing like you." "No," Ada said. The word was sharp. "I clean. I do not entertain." Pike chuckled. "Give it time. The winter gets cold." He spat into a spittoon behind the bar. "But I do need someone to muck out the main floor at dawn, and the girls act like they are royalty. Won't mend their own torn ruffles." "You can do that." "How much?" Ada asked. $4 a week," Pike said. "And you start tomorrow. Dawn. If the floor is not spotless by the time the first customer walks in, you are out." It was a pittance. It was slavery. But it was $4 more than she had. "I will take it," Ada said. Pike smirked. "I bet you will. Welcome to the family, darling." That night, the wind howled outside the boarding house like a lost soul. Ada locked her door and pushed the heavy wooden chair under the handle. It was a ritual she performed every night now. She poured water from the pitcher into the cracked basin. The water was icy cold. She stripped off her blouse and stood in her chemise, shivering in the drafty room. She dipped a rag into the water and began to scrub. She scrubbed her arms, her chest, her face. She scrubbed until her skin was pink and raw, trying to wash away the feeling of Pike's eyes, the drunk's hand, the seamstress's sneer. She looked in the small, clouded mirror above the washstand. The bruise on her jaw was fading to a sickly green, but the mark on her neck was still there. She touched it with a trembling finger. A rope burn. Silas had laughed as he held the lasso. "If you want to act like a wild mare, Ada, I will treat you like one." He had roped her when she tried to run from the house the first time. He had dragged her back across the yard while the ranch hands watched and did nothing. That was the moment something inside her had broken. And something else, something harder, colder, had been born. "Never again," she whispered to the reflection in the mirror. The eyes staring back at her were dark and hollow, but there was a spark in them. It was a tiny, fragile flame. But the wind had not blown it out yet. "I will eat dirt before I let a man own me again," she said. "I will die first." She finished washing, put on her nightgown, and lay down on the lumpy mattress. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay listening to the wind, her hand resting on the small knife she had stolen from the boarding house kitchen, hidden beneath her pillow. The morning brought the dust. It was not just a wind. It was a brown wall that swallowed the world. The sky turned a bruised ochre color, and the light filtered through it in strange, sickly rays. The grit hissed against the window panes like 1,000 snakes. Ada woke with the taste of earth in her mouth. She dressed quickly, wrapping a scarf around her nose and mouth. She had to get to the saloon. If she was late, Pike would fire her, and she would be on the street. She grabbed the bucket of slop water from her room. Mrs. Webb made the tenants empty their own basins and opened the back door of the boarding house. The gale nearly knocked her off her feet. The wind screamed, tearing at her skirts and blinding her instantly. The air was solid with flying sand. It stung her eyes and filled her ears. Ada put her head down and pushed forward, aiming for the alley where the waste barrel stood. She could barely see her own feet. She stumbled over a loose board, the bucket swinging wildly in her hand. Suddenly, a shape loomed out of the brown haze, a dark, solid wall of a man. She slammed into him hard. The impact jarred her teeth. She felt herself falling, the wind taking her balance, the ground rushing up to meet her. A hand shot out and clamped onto her elbow. It was a grip like iron, holding her up, keeping her from sprawling into the filth of the alley. Ada gasped, the bucket falling from her other hand and clattering away. Panic flared, the instinctual terror of being grabbed. She jerked back violently, wrenching her arm away. "Do not touch me!" she cried out, her voice muffled by the scarf. The man stepped back, hands raised instantly. The palms were open, showing empty space. "Easy," a voice said. It was deep, calm, and cut through the wind without shouting. "Just making sure you don't tumble into the street, ma'am." Ada blinked, wiping grit from her eyelashes. It was him, the man from the boardwalk, the man from the livery, Luke Carver. He was wearing the same duster, the collar turned up against the storm, his hat pulled low. His face was half hidden by a black bandana, leaving only his eyes visible. They were gray, the color of the storm clouds, and they were looking at her with that same steady, unreadable expression. Ada stood there, chest heaving, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She felt foolish. She felt terrified. And beneath it all, she felt a strange, jarring shock from where his hand had gripped her arm. It hadn't been a grab to possess. It had been a grab to steady. Ada started, but the wind snatched the words away. Luke lowered his hand slowly. He looked at the spilled bucket, then back at her. For a second, the distance between them felt charged, a tension that had nothing to do with the storm. He seemed to be waiting for her to speak. Or maybe he was just waiting for her to stop trembling. He took a step closer, and Ada flinched. He stopped immediately. "Go inside," he said, his voice rough. "This is no weather for walking." He held her gaze for 1 second longer, a moment of shared recognition in the chaos of the storm. He saw her fear. She saw his restraint. Then he turned and vanished into the brown wall of dust as if he had never been there at all. Ada stood alone in the alley, the grit hissing around her boots, her heart pounding a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like hope, or perhaps danger. She picked up her empty bucket and ran for the saloon. Time seemed to lose its shape in Perdition Creek, dissolving into a gray, grinding loop of labor and fatigue. 3 weeks had passed since Ada had walked into the Lucky Dollar Saloon and sold her pride for $4 a week. And in that time, she had learned that the frontier did not care for dignity. It cared only for endurance. Her mornings began before the sun had fully crested the eastern ridge, in the cold, blue light of dawn. The saloon at that hour was a graveyard of the previous night's vices. The air hung heavy and stale, a thick soup of tobacco smoke, unwashed bodies, and the sour copper tang of spilled whiskey. Ada would tie a rag around her nose and mouth, drop to her knees, and begin to scrub. The floorboards were rough-hewn pine, warped by years of spilled drinks and boot heels. She learned the geography of the room by the stains. There was the dark, sticky patch near the poker table where a man had been stabbed 2 nights ago. The blood had soaked deep into the grain, turning black and stubborn. There were the endless rings of beer on the bar top that required boiling water and lye to lift. There was the mud tracked in from the street, mixed with sawdust and spit, forming a paste that coated her hands and ruined her fingernails. By noon, her back ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm that never quite went away. The afternoon shift was different, but no less humiliating. She sat in the back room, a cramped space smelling of mothballs and cheap lavender water, and mended the dresses of the girls who worked the upstairs rooms. These women. Lola, a sharp-tongued redhead with eyes like flint, and Clementine, who looked barely older than Ada herself, treated her with a strange mix of pity and disdain. They would toss their torn bodices and ripped hems onto the table without a word, expecting Ada to fix the damage caused by rough hands and careless men. Ada stitched in silence. She repaired lace that had been clawed through, reattached buttons that had been yanked off in haste, and patched silk that was stained with sweat and cheap perfume. Every stitch felt like an act of penance for a crime she had not committed. In the evenings, back in her narrow room at the boarding house, she would scrub her hands until the skin was raw and red, trying to scour away the scent of the saloon, but the smell seemed to live in her pores now. She smelled like other people's sins. The town, small and bored, fed on her presence like coyotes on a carcass. The gossip was a living thing, growing heads and tails as it whispered down the main street. She heard it when she went to the well for water. 2 women from the church society would stop talking the moment she approached, their bonnets turning away like sunflowers shunning the dark. "I heard she came from the Brant Ranch," one would whisper, loud enough for Ada to hear. "Ran off in the middle of the night. You know what that means. Cast off," the other would agree, the word hissing like a snake. "Silas Brant has a heavy hand, but he is a wealthy man. If she ran, she must have done something truly wicked to lose his favor. Or perhaps she is just trouble. Trouble from back east, looking to snag a husband and failing at it." No one asked her. No one looked her in the eye and asked, "Why did you run?" Or, "Are you safe?" They filled the silence with their own stories, painting her as a fallen woman, a thief, a harlot who had lost her place. The assumptions hung over her like the smoke in the saloon, choking and inescapable. Ada learned to walk with her chin up and her eyes fixed on the horizon, pretending she was deaf, pretending she was made of stone, miles away, out on the open range. Luke Carver lived in a silence that was the exact opposite of the town's whispering. He had taken a job as a line rider for the Circle M, a modest outfit that bordered the Badlands to the north. It was solitary work, suited for a man who found the company of others exhausting. His days were spent in the saddle, riding the endless miles of barbed wire and split-rail fencing that marked the ranch's boundaries. The land out here was harsh and indifferent. It was a vast, rolling ocean of sagebrush and brittle grass, broken only by the sudden, violent jut of red rock buttes and the winding scars of dry creek beds. The sky was a huge, inverted bowl, blue enough to hurt the eyes, pressing down on the earth with a weight that made a man feel small. Luke preferred it this way. Out here, the wind scoured everything clean. There were no lies in the sagebrush. A rattlesnake rattled before it struck. A storm darkened the sky before it broke. The danger was honest. He checked posts that had been leaned over by scratching cattle, spliced wire that had snapped in the frost, and chased off strays that wandered too close to the poisonous larkspur in the valleys. At night, he camped in line shacks, Tiny, drafty cabins stocked with tinned beans and firewood, or slept under the stars, listening to the coyotes sing to the moon. But a man could not eat silence, and eventually, the supplies ran low. It was a Tuesday when Luke rode back into Perdition Creek to draw his pay and stock up on flour and coffee. The town felt loud after the quiet of the range. The clatter of wagons, the shouting of drovers, the barking of dogs. It all grated on his nerves. He tied his horse, the skittish roan he had finally calmed enough to ride, outside the general store. He was tossing a sack of coffee into his saddlebag when he saw her. Ada was coming out of the mercantile, struggling with a 50-pound sack of flour. She looked thinner than the last time he had seen her. Her dress, though clean, was faded, and her boots were scuffed gray. The sack was nearly half her weight, and she was fighting to hoist it onto her shoulder, her face flushed with exertion. 2 local men were lounging on the boardwalk, whittling sticks and watching her struggle. Luke recognized them. Drifters who worked odd jobs at the stables. "Careful there, sweetheart," one of them drawled, not moving a muscle to help. "That is a heavy load for such a little thing." "I could carry it for you," the others said, grinning. "But my rates are steep. I do not take coin. If you catch my meaning." The first man laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "I reckon she knows exactly what you mean. Harlan Pike's girl knows the price of a favor." Ada ignored them, her jaw set tight. She managed to get the sack onto her shoulder, but the weight made her stumble, her knees buckling slightly. Luke did not think. He just moved. He stepped up onto the boardwalk, his boots loud on the wood. The 2 men looked up, their grins faltering when they saw the size of him and the cold, flat look in his eyes. Luke ignored them entirely, as if they were nothing more than flies buzzing over a dung heap. He reached out and, with one easy motion, lifted the sack of flour from Ada's shoulder. It settled onto his own like a bag of feathers. "Where do you want this?" he asked. His voice was low, cutting through the laughter of the men. Ada blinked, looking up at him. Surprise and defensiveness warred in her face. "I can manage," she said, reaching for the sack. Luke turned his body slightly, shielding her from the drifters. "I know you can," he said, "but I am going that way. Lead on." He started walking before she could argue. Ada hesitated for a second, cast a glare at the 2 men who had suddenly found their whittling very interesting, and hurried after him. They walked in silence to the boarding house. Mrs. Webb was out, thankfully, so the hallway was empty. Luke followed Ada into the kitchen and set the sack down on the large oak table with a heavy thud. Ada stood on the other side of the table, breathing hard, her hands gripping the back of a chair. The defensiveness had won out. She felt exposed, embarrassed that he had seen her struggle, that he had heard what those men said. "I did not need saving," she said sharply. The words came out harsher than she intended, brittle with pride. "I have carried heavier things than flour." Luke took off his hat, running a hand through his dust-colored hair. He looked at her, really looked at her, noting the new hardness around her mouth and the exhaustion bruising her eyes. "I never said you needed saving," Luke replied quietly. He rested his hands on his belt, his stance relaxed. "I just figured that even a stubborn mule can use a second pair of hands on a steep trail. No shame in it." Ada's mouth opened to retort, to tell him she was not a mule, but the image, her, dusty and obstinate, kicking at a mountain, caught her off guard. The absurdity of it, combined with the utter lack of mockery in his voice, drained the anger out of her. The corner of her mouth twitched. It was a tiny movement, barely there, but it was the first crack in the ice. "I suppose the mule would be grateful," she said, her voice softening. "If the mule could talk." "I reckon it would," Luke said. For a second, the faintest hint of a smile flickered between them. It was tentative, fragile as a spiderweb, but it was real. Then the moment passed. Luke put his hat back on, tipping the brim. "Good day, ma'am," he said. "Good day," Ada whispered. She watched him walk out, the kitchen suddenly feeling very empty and very quiet. The fear, however, did not leave as easily as the anger. A week later, the sun had set early, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black. Ada had stayed late at the boarding house to wash her own clothes, utilizing the heavy iron tub in the wash house out back. She was walking back from the well, a bucket of fresh rinse water in her hand. When the wind shifted, she heard the crunch of a boot on gravel behind her. It was a distinct sound, heavy and purposeful. Panic surged through her like a lightning strike. The bucket slipped from her fingers, water splashing cold over her boots, but she didn't feel it. Suddenly, she was back there. The hallway. The heavy footsteps of Silas Brandt coming for her room. The sound of the key not turning fast enough. She spun around, a gasp tearing from her throat, her hands coming up to protect her face. Luke stood 10 feet away. He had stopped dead the moment she turned. He was holding a white square of fabric in his hand, her kerchief. She must have dropped it near the well. He did not move closer. He did not smile. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way her pupils were blown wide, the way she was trembling so hard she looked like she might shatter. He recognized that look. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers who had been on the line too long. "You drop this," he said. His voice was pitched low, careful not to startle her further. He held the kerchief out, but he stayed exactly where he was, giving her space, letting the distance act as a shield. Ada stared at him, her chest heaving. The adrenaline was still flooding her veins, making her dizzy. She lowered her hands slowly, realizing it was just Luke, just the man who spoke gently to horses. She choked on the word. She pressed a hand to her heart, trying to force it to slow down. "I know," Luke said. He lowered his hand but didn't approach. "I should have called out sooner. I did not mean to spook you." Ada looked at the kerchief, then at him. The shame of her reaction burned hot in her throat. She hated this. She hated that a sound in the dark could reduce her to a shaking child. She hated that Silas Brandt still owned her fear, even from 100 miles away. "I hate it," she blurted out. The words came rushing out before she could stop them, raw and bitter. "I hate feeling helpless. I hate that I jump at shadows. I hate that men are always bigger, stronger, faster. It is not fair." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the evening chill. "I am tired of being afraid." Luke watched her. He did not offer platitudes. He did not tell her it would get better or that she was safe now. He knew better. The world was not safe. He looked down at the kerchief in his hand, then back at her. He seemed to be weighing something, making a decision. "Helpless is a feeling," Luke said slowly. "It is not a fact." He took one step forward, then stopped again, respecting the invisible line drawn in the dirt between them. "If you want," he said. "I can teach you." Ada frowned, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Teach me what?" "How to stop jumping," Luke said. "How to defend yourself. With a gun. With your feet. With your voice. So you do not have to rely on luck or a locked door." Ada stared at him. A gun. The idea was foreign. Terrifying. Women did not shoot. Women hid. Women endured. But she remembered the weight of the flour sack he had lifted so easily. She remembered the drunk gripping her wrist. She remembered Silas. She looked at Luke's face. There was no mockery there, only a serious, solemn offer. He was offering her power. She hesitated, the wind tugging at her damp skirts. Then she squared her shoulders. "When?" she asked. "Dawn," Luke said. "Tomorrow. Meet me at the old cottonwood by the creek. Bring nothing but yourself." Ada nodded once. "I will be there." The dawn was cold enough to freeze breath in the throat. The sky was a pale, watery gray, and the frost on the sagebrush looked like silver dust. Ada was shivering when she reached the cottonwood tree, but not just from the cold. Luke was already there. He had a small campfire going, barely more than a handful of twigs to warm the hands. On a flat rock nearby lay a pistol. It was a Colt, smaller than the one he carried, the metal dark and oily. "Morning," Luke said. He did not look at her, focused on feeding a twig to the fire. Warm your hands. Can't shoot if your fingers are numb. Ada held her hands over the tiny flame. Is that yours? She asked, looking at the gun. It was, Luke said. It is lighter than my peacemaker. Good for learning. He stood up and picked up the weapon. He checked the cylinder, spun it, and held it out to her. Handle first. Take it. Ada reached out. The metal was heavy, heavier than she expected, and cold. It felt alien in her palm, a thing of death and violence. Do not put your finger on the trigger until you are ready to destroy what is in front of you, Luke said. His voice was stripped of all casualness. It was the voice of a teacher, precise and demanding. He showed her how to stand. Feet apart, shoulder width, plant your heels. If you stand like a lady at a tea party, the recoil will put you on your backside. Ada spread her feet. She felt ridiculous, unladylike. Lean into it, Luke instructed. He moved behind her. Ada tensed, expecting his hands on her waist or her arms to correct her posture. That was how men taught women things, by touching them. But Luke did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his coat, close enough to smell the wood smoke and leather on him. But he kept his hands to himself. Elbows soft, not locked, he murmured from behind her right shoulder. Bring your left hand up to cup the bottom. Steady the weight. Ada adjusted her grip. Like this. Higher, Luke said. Choke up on the grip. If you hold it low, it will jump out of your hand. She moved her hand. Better, he said. Now, look down the sights. See that little notch? Put the front sight right in the middle of it. Ada squinted. The barrel wavered. Her arms were already shaking from the weight and the tension. Breathe. Luke's voice was right by her ear, low and grounding. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Squeeze the trigger at the bottom of the breath. When you are empty, do not pull it. Squeeze it, like you are wringing out a wet cloth. Ada aimed at the trunk of a dead willow tree 20 yards away. She inhaled. She exhaled. Her heart was hammering. She squeezed. The explosion was deafening. The gun bucked in her hand like a live animal, jumping violently upward. The sound slapped against the low hills and echoed back. A flock of crows exploded from the cottonwood branches, cawing in outrage. Ada gasped, nearly dropping the gun. She stumbled back a step. I missed, she said, her voice trembling. She pointed to the tree. The bark was untouched. I missed the whole tree. Luke stepped around to face her. He did not look disappointed. You fired, he said. That is the first step. The bullet went wide, probably 10 feet to the left. You flinched before you pulled the trigger. You were anticipating the noise. It is loud, Ada said, rubbing her ringing ears. It is, Luke agreed. Do it again. They met every morning for 2 weeks. The routine became a secret anchor in Ada's life. While the town slept, she walked out into the cold, gray world to learn the language of violence. It was frustrating work. Her arms ached, her ears rang. The smell of burnt black powder became a scent she associated with the sunrise, mixing with the sharp, clean smell of sage. Luke was patient, but he was not soft. He did not praise her for trying. He praised her for improving. A gun is not a magic wand, Ada, he told her one morning, as she rubbed a sore wrist. It is not a promise of safety. It is just a tool, like a hammer or a needle. A needle does not kill people, Ada muttered. A needle cannot stop a man who wants to hurt you. Luke countered. He looked out at the horizon, his eyes narrowing. The gun does not make you safe. What makes you safe is the will to stand, the will to say no and mean it, even if it costs you everything. The gun just gives your no teeth. I do not know if I have that will, Ada whispered. I ran away. Luke looked at her then, his gaze intense. You ran to survive. That is not weakness. Weakness is staying and letting them break you. You are still here. You are standing in the cold, learning to shoot. That looks like will to me. Ada held on to those words. She wrapped them around herself like a blanket when she went back to the saloon to scrub the floors. That looks like will to me. The breakthrough happened on a Tuesday. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, hard blue. The sun was just crowning the distant mesas, turning the rock to burning pink and gold. Luke had set up a tin can on a fence post 30 yards away. It looked impossibly small. "Take your time," Luke said. He was leaning against the cottonwood, watching her. Ada raised the colt. It felt lighter today. Her hand fit the grip as if it had been made for it. She planted her feet in the dirt, feeling the connection to the earth. She took a breath. In, out. She did not think about Silas. She did not think about the gossip. She thought about the line of sight, front sight, notch, target. The world narrowed down to that one rusted tin can. She squeezed. Crack! The sound ripped through the air. The tin can jumped as if it had been kicked. It spun wildly into the air, catching the sunlight, and landed in the grass with a clatter. A clean hole punched right through the center. Silence followed. Ada lowered the gun, staring at the empty fence post. She blinked. "I hit it," she said softly. Then, a bubble of something hot and bright rose in her chest. "I hit it," she shouted. She turned to Luke, a laugh escaping her lips. It was a sound she hadn't heard from herself in months, unguarded, unbelieving, and completely free. Luke was pushing himself off the tree. He was grinning. It transformed his face, erasing the years and the scars, making him look younger, lighter. "Dead center," he said, walking toward her. "That was a fine shot." "Ada." "I did it," Ada said, still laughing. She looked at the gun in her hand, then at him. "Did you see it fly?" "I saw it," Luke said. He stopped in front of her. The grin faded into a warm, steady smile. Pride flickered in his eyes, not the possessive pride of a man who has trained a dog, but the respectful pride of a man watching an equal rise. The laughter died down, replaced by a sudden, humming silence. They were close, closer than they usually stood. The adrenaline of the shot was still buzzing in the air, mixing with something else, something magnetic. Ada looked up at him, her breath catching. She saw the gray of his eyes, the rough texture of his skin, the way he was looking at her mouth. For a moment, she thought he might reach out. She thought he might touch her face. And for the first time since she had arrived in Perdition Creek, the thought did not terrify her. Luke seemed to sense the shift. His eyes darkened slightly. He took a breath, as if to speak, or to move. But the habit of restraint was deep. He shifted his weight, stepping back half a pace, breaking the charge in the air. "We should clean the gun," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. "Powder rusts the barrel if you leave it." Ada let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Yes," she said. "Yes, we should." But as they walked back to the rock to clean the weapon, the space between them felt different. It was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. The fragility of their peace was shattered 2 days later. It was late afternoon. The saloon was busy, the noise level rising with the setting sun. Ada was sweeping near the entrance, trying to make herself invisible. The swinging doors groaned open, and a man walked in. He was not a local. His coat was fine wool, clean and well cut, though dusted with travel. His boots were polished, but it was the saddlebags he carried over his shoulder that stopped Ada's heart cold. Burned into the leather was a brand she knew better than her own name. A stylized B inside a circle. Brant. Ada froze, gripping the broom handle so hard her knuckles turned white. She backed into the shadows near the piano, her pulse roaring in her ears. The stranger walked up to the bar. Harlan Pike looked up, wiping a glass. He saw the cut of the man's clothes, the money evident in his bearing. "Whiskey," the stranger said. "The good stuff, not the swill you serve the drovers." Pike's obsequious smile appeared instantly. "Of course, sir. Right away." They spoke in low tones. Ada strained to hear, but the noise of the room drowned them out. But she saw the stranger gesture vaguely around the room, then lean in closer to Pike. She saw Pike's eyes flick toward the back of the room, scanning the crowd. His gaze passed over the shadows where she stood, then returned to the stranger. He nodded. a look of sudden, greasy respect dawning on his face. The stranger finished his drink, tossed a coin on the bar, and turned to survey the room. His eyes were cold, calculating. He was looking for something, or someone. He didn't see her. He turned and walked out, his spurs chiming softly. Ada let out a shuddering breath. She felt sick. Later that night, as she was scrubbing the last table, Harlan Pike stumbled out of his office. He was drunk, his face flushed. He saw Ada on her knees. He walked over, swaying slightly, and stood over her. "Well now," Pike slurred. He looked down at her with a new kind of sneer, one mixed with fear and a twisted sort of glee. "I didn't know we had royalty scrubbing the floors." Ada sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron. "I do not know what you mean. Mr. Pike." "The man from the south," Pike said, leaning down. His breath smelled of rot. "He was asking about a girl who ran off from Silas Brandt." Ada's blood turned to ice. She said nothing. Pike chuckled. "Silas Brandt. He owns half the territory south of here, and you belong to him." He reached out and patted her cheek. It was a soft, wet slap. "Brandt's girl," he whispered. "You are worth a lot of money, darling. I reckon I better keep a close eye on you." He straightened up and laughed, wandering off toward the stairs. Ada remained on the floor, the cold seeping through her skirts. The fire in the stove crackled in the corner, but it offered no heat. A chill had settled into her bones, deep and permanent. The distance between Perdition Creek and the life she fled had suddenly vanished. The map had closed. He knew where she was, and this time, a locked door would not be enough. The noise in the Lucky Dollar Saloon was a physical weight, a thick blanket of fiddle music, shouting men, and the clinking of cheap glass that usually made it impossible to hear anything else. But fear had a way of sharpening the senses, tuning out the roar of the crowd until only the things that mattered remained. It was late, nearing the hour when Harlan Pike would expect the floors to be swept for the second time. Ada was near the back hallway, a heavy bucket of water in her hand, when the door to Pike's office drifted open just an inch. The draft carried the smell of expensive cigar smoke, a scent that did not belong in Perdition Creek, a scent that belonged to a mahogany-paneled room hundreds of miles away. Ada froze. The bucket grew heavy in her grip, the wire handle digging into her palm, but she did not set it down. She pressed herself into the shadow of the stairwell, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. "He is losing patience," a voice said. It was the stranger, the man with the clean coat and the cold eyes. "Mr. Brandt is a man who values order, having his property scattered across the territory like stray cattle. It offends him." "I understand. Mr. Vance." Harlan Pike's voice was oily, dripping with an eagerness to please that made Ada's stomach turn. "But you understand my position. She is skittish. If I push too hard, she might bolt again. And I reckon Mr. Brandt wants her back in one piece." "He wants her back," Vance corrected, his tone flat. "The condition is secondary. He wants to make an example. You cannot have livestock thinking they can open the gate and walk away whenever they choose. It sets a bad precedent for the rest of the herd." "Livestock?" The word hit Ada like a physical blow. The air in her lungs turned to ice. They were not talking about a horse or a cow. They were talking about her. "He is buying up the valley south of here," Vance continued, the rustle of paper audible through the crack in the door. "The law in this territory is becoming flexible, Mr. Brandt has friends in the governor's mansion. If you help us secure his property, Harlan, the Lucky Dollar could find itself with a very generous line of credit. If not, well, accidents happen to wooden buildings in dry weather." "There is no need for threats," Pike said quickly. "I am a friend to Silas Brandt. I always have been. You just tell me when the wagon is coming, and I will see to it she is ready. We can say she owes a debt. The sheriff will not look twice." Ada dropped the bucket. It did not fall far, and the sawdust on the floor muffled the clang. But the splash of water soaked the hem of her dress. She did not feel the cold, She felt only the sudden, crushing suffocation of the past reaching out to strangle her future. The hallway dissolved. She was no longer in the saloon. She was back in the library of the big house, the heavy velvet drapes drawn against the sun. She could smell the brandy on Silas's breath. She could feel the crushing weight of his hand on her wrist, grinding the bones together. "You are nothing," his voice hissed in her memory, wrapping around her throat. "My charity kept you fed. My money buried your father. You belong to me, Ada, body and soul. And if you try to speak, if you try to tell anyone what happens in this room, I will ruin you. I will paint you as a whore in every town from here to the border." Who will they believe? The man who built the church? Or the little beggar girl who lifted her skirts for a warm bed? "No," Ada whispered. The word was a ghost of sound. She turned and ran. She did not wait to be seen. She did not wait for Pike to come out and check the noise. She burst through the back door of the saloon, stumbling out into the cool, dark air of the alley. Her boots slipped in the mud. She gasped for air, but her throat felt closed, constricted by the phantom rope that had once burned her skin. She was hyperventilating, her vision spotting with black. She needed to hide. She needed to run, but there was nowhere to run. He was buying the law. He was buying the land. He was everywhere. She rounded the corner of the woodpile blindly and slammed hard into a solid wall of a chest. A pair of hands came up instantly, gripping her shoulders to keep her from falling. "Easy," a deep voice rumbled. "Where is the fire?" Ada recoiled violently, a scream tearing at her throat. She struck out, her hand connecting with a heavy wool coat, fighting like a trapped animal. "Let me go," she cried, the sound ragged. "Do not touch me." The hands released her immediately. Stepping back, "Ada!" The name cut through the panic. It was not a threat. It was a grounding wire. She blinked, her chest heaving, her eyes adjusting to the moonlight. Luke Carver stood there, one hand raised in a gesture of peace, the other resting on his belt. He had just come from the livery, likely to collect his winnings from the weekly poker game he played with the stable hands. The light from the saloon window caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone and the steady, gray calm of his eyes. He looked at her, really looked at her, and his expression shifted from surprise to a sharp, dangerous alertness. He saw the terror radiating off her in waves. He saw the way she was shaking, vibrating so hard her teeth were almost chattering. "What happened?" Luke asked. His voice dropped, losing all casualness. It became the quiet, lethal tone he used when he sensed a predator. Ada wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold her shattering pieces together. "He found me," she whispered. "He knows I am here." Luke frowned slightly. "Who? Pike?" "No," Ada choked out. She looked over her shoulder at the saloon door, expecting Vance to burst through at any second. "Him, the man I ran from?" Luke took a step closer, placing himself between her and the door. "The rancher. Silas Brandt," she said. The name landed in the alley like a stone dropped in deep water. Luke went very still. The air around him seemed to change, temperature dropping. His jaw clenched, the muscle feathering tight beneath the skin, his knuckles, resting on his belt, turned white. "Brandt," Luke repeated. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He knew the name. God, he knew the name. 5 years ago, before he had drifted north to Wyoming. Luke had worked a season on the Circle B spread in New Mexico. He had lasted 3 months. He had seen how Silas Brandt treated his horses, riding them until their hearts burst, then leaving them for the buzzards. He had seen how he treated his men, cheating them on pay, working them into the ground, firing them for injuries sustained on his land. Luke had left after he found Brandt beating a young stable boy with a quirt for spilling a bucket of oats. Luke had stepped in, knocked Brandt into the dust, and ridden out with a price on his head for assault. He knew exactly what kind of monster hid behind the silk vests and church donations. And now that monster was hunting Ada. The connection tightened the knot in Luke's chest until it was hard to breathe. He looked at Ada, seeing the fresh terror layered over the old trauma, and a rage so pure and hot it nearly blinded him, surged up his spine. "Come with me," Luke said. He did not touch her. He simply nodded toward the deeper shadows of the alley, away from the door. He led her to a stack of crates behind the general store, out of sight of the street. The wind was picking up, rattling the loose shingles on the roof, covering their voices. "Tell me," Luke said. He took off his hat and turned it in his hands, his eyes never leaving her face. "Tell me what he did." Ada leaned against the rough wood of the building. She looked small in the dark, stripped of her defenses. She took a shuddering breath, and the dam broke. She told him. She told him the bare bones, the skeleton of the nightmare she had been carrying alone for months. "My father worked for him," she began, her voice trembling. "When Papa died in the blizzard. Silas. Mr. Brandt. He came to the funeral. He told me I could stay in the cottage. He said he would protect me. He said he was a friend." She looked down at her hands, twisting the fabric of her skirt. "But then he started coming by. Late. He would bring gifts I did not want. He would touch my hair. When I asked him to stop, he told me I was ungrateful. He told me I owed him for the roof over my head." Luke did not speak. He stood like a statue, listening to the poison spill out. "He stopped asking," Ada whispered. She could not look at Luke. She stared at the dirt. "One night, he took the key. He came in." She skipped the ugliest details. She did not tell him about the struggle, the tearing of clothes, the pain. She did not have to. Luke heard it in the silence. He heard it in the way her voice broke. He heard it in the way she hunched her shoulders, as if expecting a blow. "After," she said, tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. "He told everyone I had come to him. He told the sheriff I was a loose woman who tried to blackmail him. He said if I spoke the truth, he would destroy me. He said no one listens to a pauper when a king is speaking." Luke's hat crumpled in his grip. The leather groaned. He wanted to kill him. The urge was not a flicker. It was a roaring fire. He wanted to ride south, find Silas Brandt, and tear him apart with his bare hands. He wanted to make him feel every ounce of fear he had inflicted on this woman. But Luke Carver was not a fool. He knew how the world worked. Brandt had money. He had lawmen in his pocket. He had hired guns. If Luke rode out now, he would be dead before he crossed the county line, and Ada would be left alone, defenseless. He forced his hands to relax. He forced the red haze to recede, just enough to think. "He is not going to touch you," Luke said. His voice was a vow, low and rough. "Not while I am drawing breath." Ada looked up, her eyes wet and wide. "He has men here. I heard them. They are going to take me back. They called me property. Luke, like a stray heifer." "We cannot stay here," Luke said. The decision formed instantly. "Perdition Creek is dying, and the law here is cheap. Pike will sell you out for a new roof. We need to leave." "Leave?" Ada asked. "Go where?" "The rail line is 2 days' ride north," Luke said. "We can catch a train. Go west, Oregon, maybe, or east to St. Louis, somewhere his money does not reach." Ada stared at him. Run again. The thought made her sick. She had been running for months. She was tired of looking over her shoulder. She was tired of being the prey. "And then what?" she asked bitterly. "He finds us there? He has money. Luke, he can hire Pinkertons. He can buy tickets. If I run, I am just admitting he is right, that I am something to be chased." "It is not about being right," Luke said, stepping closer. "It is about staying alive. You cannot fight an army, Ada." "I am tired of running," she whispered. "I want to stand." "You can stand when you are not in the crosshairs," Luke said gently. "Think on it, but we have to move fast." The next few days stretched the tension in Perdition Creek until it hummed like a wire about to snap. Luke kept his distance during the day to avoid drawing attention, but he was always there, a shadow on the periphery, watching the saloon, watching the boarding house. Ada felt his presence like a shield, but even shields could be heavy. The town, sensing the shift in the wind, turned its back on her completely. Mrs. Webb stopped serving Ada coffee at breakfast. When Ada asked why, the landlady sniffed, wiping the counter with aggressive strokes. "I have heard stories," Mrs. Webb said, her eyes cold, "about why you left the South. A woman who seduces her betters and then cries, 'Wolf brings trouble to a house.' I think it would be best if you found other arrangements soon. Or perhaps," she paused, looking Ada up and down with a sneer, "perhaps you should take one of the offers you have received. Mr. Pike is a businessman. He could protect a girl like you if you were more accommodating." Ada walked out without a word, her face burning. In the street, it was worse. The respectable wives of the town, the baker's wife, the pastor's sister, crossed the mud to avoid walking on the same boardwalk as her. One afternoon, a child waved at Ada. His mother yanked his arm so hard the boy stumbled, pulling him behind her skirts as if Ada carried the plague. "Don't you look at her," the mother hissed, loud enough for the street to hear. "Sin is catching. Boy!" Ada walked with her head high, but inside, she was crumbling. They had already decided who she was. Silas didn't even have to be here to ruin her name. His shadow was enough. One night, the darkness was absolute. The moon was hidden behind a thick bank of clouds, and the only light came from the flickering lanterns of the saloon. Luke waited for her outside the back door as her shift ended. He didn't speak, just fell into step beside her as she started the walk to the boarding house. They walked in silence for a long time. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the distant howl of a coyote. "They are getting bolder," Luke said quietly. "The stranger, Vance, he was watching you through the window today." "I know," Ada said. She hugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Mrs. Webb gave me notice. 2 days. She says she needs the room for a paying guest. There is no guest." "We leave tomorrow night," Luke said. "I have the horses ready. I traded the roan for a sturdy pack mare. We can make the ridge by dawn." Ada stopped. They were under the overhang of the general store, shielded from the wind. She looked at him in the dim light. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the scar on his cheek stood out in stark relief. He was keeping watch all night. She realized he wasn't sleeping. "You are doing so much," she said softly. "Why? Why risk yourself for someone everyone says is trash?" Luke turned to her. His gaze was steady, anchoring her. "I do not care what they say," he said. "I know what I see." "And what do you see?" Ada asked, her voice barely a whisper. Luke took a step closer. The space between them seemed to vanish. "I see a woman who walked through hell and came out standing," he said. "I see someone who learned to shoot because she refused to be a victim. I see—" He hesitated, his voice dropping to a rough murmur. "I see the only thing in this town worth a damn." Ada's breath hitched. "Luke, I am not leaving you, Ada," he said. "Not now, not ever. If we run together. If we stand together." The confession hung in the air, raw and honest. "I feel safe with you," Ada admitted, the words trembling. And exposed, like you see all the broken parts and you do not look away." "There is nothing broken about you," Luke said. He reached out, his hand moving slowly, giving her every second to pull away. He cupped her cheek. His palm was rough, calloused from years of rope and rain, but his touch was incredibly gentle. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. Ada did not pull away. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes. A sob caught in her throat, not of sadness, but of relief. Luke lowered his head. He paused a breath away from her lips. Waiting. Ada bridged the gap. She pressed her mouth to his. It was hesitant at first, a question asked in the dark. Luke responded with a tenderness that shattered her. He kissed her not to take, but to give. He kissed her as if she were precious. The kiss deepened. Ada's hands came up to clutch the front of his coat. She needed to feel him, solid, real, warm. The desire that flared in her was sudden and intense, a desperate need to feel something other than fear, to reclaim her body as something capable of pleasure, not just pain. She pressed closer, her body molding against his. Luke's arm went around her waist, pulling her in. And then, the memory snapped. It was the feeling of being held tight, the restriction of movement. Suddenly, it wasn't Luke's arm. It was Silas's heavy grip. It wasn't the smell of sage and tobacco. It was brandy and sweat. Ada went rigid. Her breath seized in her lungs. She shoved Luke away, gasping. "No!" she cried out, stumbling back. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her eyes wild. I can't! Luke stepped back instantly. His hands went up, palms open. He put 3 feet of distance between them in a heartbeat. "It is all right," he said. His voice was calm, steady. No anger, no frustration. "It is all right, Ada. I am sorry," Ada gasped, tears springing to her eyes. "I am so sorry. I wanted to. I just—" "Stop," Luke said gently. "Do not apologize. You never have to apologize for that. Not to me." He looked at her with an aching sadness, but his stance was firm. "You choose. Always. If you want to stop, we stop. If you never want to be touched again, I will never touch you again. You own yourself, Ada. No one else." The words washed over her like cool water. "You own yourself?" She looked at him, shaking, and saw only patience. He wasn't Silas. He wasn't the men in the saloon. He was Luke, and he was waiting for her to be ready. "Thank you," she whispered. "Come on," Luke said, keeping his distance. "Let me walk you the rest of the way." The morning sun brought no warmth. The sky was a hard, enamel blue, and the wind bit through layers of wool. Ada was walking to the market, her head down. When a shadow fell across her path, she looked up. It was Vance. He was standing in the middle of the boardwalk, blocking her way. He touched the brim of his hat with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Ada," he said. "Lovely morning for a walk." Ada tried to step around him. He moved sideways, blocking her again. "Please let me pass," she said, her hand going to the pocket where she now carried the small pistol Luke had given her. "There is no need for unpleasantness," Vance said softly. "I just wanted to deliver a message from Mr. Brandt. He is a merciful man. Ada, he is willing to forgive your indiscretions. He wants you home." "I have no home with him," Ada said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Vance's smile vanished. His face went hard and flat. "You are making this difficult," he said, "and dangerous. Not just for you." He looked past her, toward the livery stable where Luke's horse was tied. "That cowboy of yours," Vance said casually. "Carver. He seems like a capable man. But accidents happen out here on the frontier. Horses spook, guns misfire. Men disappear in the Badlands and are never found." He looked back at Ada. "It would be a shame if something happened to him because of your stubbornness. Silas Brandt removes obstacles. Ada, he does not walk around them." The threat was clear as glass. "If you touch him," Ada started, her voice shaking with rage. "Then come home," Vance interrupted. "The wagon leaves in 2 days. Be on it, or the cowboy pays the debt for you." He tipped his hat again and walked away, leaving Ada standing in the street, the blood draining from her face. That night, the moon was hidden again. Luke rode up the ridge to his cabin, his mind churning. He had spent the day scouting the route north. It was clear, but the weather was turning. A storm was brewing over the mountains. They had to move soon. He swung down from the saddle, leading his horse into the small lean-to barn. He pitched hay, checked the water trough, and walked toward the cabin door, the fatigue settling into his bones. He stopped. Something was hanging on his door. It was a dark, shapeless mass, swaying slightly in the wind. Luke drew his revolver instantly, scanning the darkness. The woods were silent. Too silent. No crickets, no owls. He approached the door slowly. The hammer of his gun pulled back. As he got closer, the smell hit him. Fresh blood and musk. It was a coyote. The animal had been shot and strung up by its hind legs, nailed to the wood of Luke's door. Its mouth was frozen in a snarl. Blood dripping onto the threshold step. Pinned to the mangy fur of the coyote's chest was a piece of paper. Luke holstered his gun and stepped closer. He pulled the paper free, in the dim light of the lantern hanging by the door. He read the scrawled handwriting. Brant does not like his dogs poached. Luke stared at the dead animal. The message was not subtle. Ada was the dog in Brant's eyes, a piece of property that had been stolen. And Luke was the poacher. And poachers were shot. Rage, hot and blinding, flared in his gut again. But this time, it was mixed with a cold, sickly realization. This wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. Brant knew where he lived. Brant knew he was standing between him and Ada, and the town. Luke looked down at the lights of Perdition Creek flickering in the valley below. The town would not help them. The town would watch them burn and warm their hands on the fire, as long as Brant's money kept flowing. He crumpled the note in his fist. They couldn't just run. If they ran, Brant would hunt them down one by one. If they ran, they would always be looking over their shoulders. But they couldn't stay. Luke looked at the dead coyote, then at the rifle leaning against the wall inside his cabin. "Take it back," he whispered to the silence. He didn't know how yet, but he knew that running was no longer the answer. The war had come to his doorstep, and Luke Carver was done retreating. The land, like the men who sought to tame it, had a way of waiting until a man was distracted before it tried to kill him. Luke Carver was 3 days into a cattle drive for the Circle M when the trap was sprung. It was a dusty, wind-scoured afternoon, the kind where the grit coated the back of the throat and the sun beat down with a flat, hammering weight. They were moving 500 head of skittish longhorns through a narrow box canyon known as Devil's Throat, the red rock walls rising high on either side, trapping the heat and the noise. Luke was riding drag, bringing up the rear, choking on the dust kicked up by 2,000 hooves. His job was to keep the stragglers moving, pushing the stubborn calves and the limping cows forward so the herd stayed tight. He was riding a borrowed bay gelding, a sturdy animal that lacked the fire of his roan, but held a line well enough. The trouble started with a deceptive quiet. A calf broke away from the herd, bolting toward a patch of scrub oak near the canyon wall. Luke spurred the bay, leaning forward to cut the animal off before it could vanish into the brush. He felt the saddle shift beneath him a split second before disaster struck. There was no warning creak of leather, no slow giving way. The cinch simply parted. One moment Luke was centered. The next, the saddle slid violently to the left, gravity taking over with terrifying speed. Luke kicked his boots free of the stirrups, an instinct honed by years of riding half-broke Mustangs, and threw himself clear just as the saddle swung under the horse's belly. The bay, terrified by the sudden weight banging against its legs, bucked hard, squealing in panic. Luke hit the ground hard, his shoulders slamming into the rocky earth. The air left his lungs in a painful whoosh. He rolled, scrambling on hands and knees to get away from the thrashing hooves. The bay's panic was contagious. The nearest steers, already spooked by the echoes in the canyon, saw the horse bucking and turned. A ripple of fear moved through the herd like wind through wheat. "Stampede!" someone shouted up the line, the voice thin and high over the growing roar. Luke was on the ground, in the dust, with 50 head of cattle turning back toward him. The ground began to shake. He saw the white of their eyes, the lowered horns, the massive, driving weight of beef and muscle coming like a landslide. He did not have time to stand. He scrambled backward, crab-walking through the dirt, his eyes locking onto a narrow fissure in the canyon wall 10 yards away. He threw himself into the crack in the rock just as the lead steer thundered past, its flank brushing his boot. The smell of musk and fear was suffocating. Dust billowed in thick, choking clouds, turning day into twilight. For 2 minutes, the world was nothing but noise, the thunder of hooves, the clacking of horns, the bellows of frightened animals. When the dust finally began to settle, Luke climbed out of the fissure, coughing until his chest ached. His duster was torn. His left arm was throbbing with a deep, dull pain, and his face was masked in red dirt. He walked over to where his saddle lay in the dirt, trampled and battered. The bay had run off with the herd. Luke knelt and picked up the cinch. He brushed the dust away from the leather strap. It had not snapped. Leather that breaks under strain leaves jagged, fibrous edges. This edge was clean, smooth. It had been cut, slice and 3/4 of the way through with a razor-sharp knife, leaving just enough to hold until the horse started working hard. Luke stood up, the cut leather clenched in his fist. He looked toward the front of the herd, where the other hands were calming the cattle. He limped toward them. The foreman, a thick-necked man named Miller, who had been hired only a week prior, watched him come. Miller sat on his horse, relaxed, rolling a cigarette. "Hell of a spill, Carver," Miller said, lighting the tobacco. He did not look concerned. "You ought to check your tack better. Old leather dries out." Luke stopped at the horse's shoulder. He held up the cinch. "This isn't dry rot," Luke said, his voice grating like stones grinding together. "It is a knife cut." Miller looked at the strap, then shrugged. "Rocks are sharp out here. Maybe you snagged it on a piece of slate." "Slate does not slice like a skinning knife," Luke said. He looked around the circle of riders. Most of them looked away, suddenly interested in their reins or the horizon. They knew, or they suspected, and they were staying out of it. "Accidents happen," Miller said, his tone final. He blew a stream of smoke toward Luke. "If you are too clumsy to stay in the saddle, maybe you should draw your time. We do not need dead weight." Luke looked at the foreman's face, the smirk hidden in the corners of his eyes. He realized then that Miller wasn't just incompetent. He was bought. Brant's money had reached even the Circle M. "I will finish the drive," Luke said, tying the broken cinch around his belt loop. "But I will be riding drag with my eyes open," Miller chuckled. "Suit yourself. Just try not to get stepped on." Luke rode back into Perdition Creek 2 days later, stiff, bruised, and riding the bay bareback. The anger inside him had cooled into a hard, heavy knot in his gut. They were not just trying to scare him anymore. They were trying to kill him. But as he rode down the main street, he realized the war had two fronts. A crowd had gathered in front of Mrs. Webb's boarding house. It wasn't a happy crowd. There was laughter, cruel and sharp, and the murmuring of people watching a spectacle they felt justified in enjoying. Luke urged the tired horse forward, pushing through the edge of the mob. In the center of the muddy street, a trunk lay open, upside down. Dresses, cheap calico, and one mended muslin were scattered in the muck. A hairbrush, a small mirror, and a pair of worn boots were strewn about like garbage. Ada was on her knees in the mud. She was frantically trying to gather her things, her hands shaking as she grabbed a dress that was already soaked with brown filth. Her hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in her face. Standing on the boardwalk above her was Harlan Pike. He was smoking a cigar, looking down at her with the benevolence of a king punishing a peasant. "I told you, sweetheart," Pike announced, his voice carrying to the back of the crowd. "Mrs. Webb sold the deed to me this morning. I am the landlord now. And I have a strict policy. Tenants who cannot pay the rent with coin have to pay with service. You refused the terms." "I paid my rent," Ada cried out, clutching a muddy petticoat to her chest. She looked up at him, tears of humiliation cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "I paid through the end of the week." "Rates went up," Pike said, grinning. "Inflation. You are short. And since you are too good to be friendly to Mr. Brant's associates, you are not welcome under my roof, or any roof in this town. If I have my say." A man in the crowd, one of the drifters who hung around the saloon, laughed. "Looks like the princess is playing in the pig pen where she belongs." Ada flinched as if she had been struck. She looked around the circle of faces. Women she had seen at church looked away or whispered behind their hands. Men stared at her tearing dress with open lust. She was utterly, completely alone. She reached for her small mirror, but a boot stepped on it before she could touch it. The glass crunched. She looked up. It was the deputy. He smiled at her, tapping his badge. "Move along. Miss, you are blocking traffic." Ada stayed on her knees, the mud soaking through her skirt, the cold seeping into her bones. She stopped trying to gather her things. She just bowed her head, her shoulders shaking, waiting for the next blow. "Get up!" The voice was not loud, but it cut through the laughter like a whip crack. The crowd parted. Luke walked into the circle. He was covered in trail dust, his face bruised, walking with a pronounced limp. But he moved with a terrifying, focused intensity. He stopped in front of Ada. He did not look at Pike. He did not look at the deputy. He looked only at her. He reached down, took her arm, and pulled her to her feet. He did not care about the mud on her hands. He steadied her when she swayed. "Luke," she whispered, her voice cracking. He threw. Luke turned slowly to face Harlan Pike. The saloon owner's grin faltered slightly. "You have made your point." "Harlan," Luke said. "Just evicting a squatter." "Carver," Pike said, trying to bluster. "Business is business." "This isn't business," Luke said. "It is a dog show. And you are the one wearing the collar?" The crowd gasped. Pike's face turned a mottled purple. "You watch your mouth, Cowboy, unless you want to join her in the street." "She is not staying in the street," Luke announced. He pitched his voice so every soul in Perdition Creek could hear him. "She is staying with me." Silence dropped over the crowd. A scandal. An unmarried woman and a man with a reputation for violence, living together in a line shack? It confirmed every nasty rumor they had whispered. "Well," Pike sneered, "I guess trash collects trash." Luke ignored him. He stooped down, scooped up Ada's trunk with one arm, and tossed the muddy clothes inside. He hoisted the trunk onto his shoulder. "Come on," he said to Ada. She hesitated, looking at the faces of the townspeople. They were judging her. They were condemning her. But then she looked at Luke, bruised, limping, standing between her and the world like a wall of granite. She lifted her chin. She wiped the mud from her cheek with a dignity that made the deputy look down at his boots. "Yes," she said clearly. "I am ready." She walked out of the circle beside him, leaving her ruined mirror in the mud. The cabin on the ridge was small, built of rough-hewn logs that had turned gray with age. It was perched on a shelf of rock overlooking the valley, exposed to the wind but commanding a view of the only trail up. Inside, it was sparse. A single cast-iron stove sat in the corner, a battered table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. A set of elk antlers hung over the door, used as a rifle rack. It was clean, though the floor was swept, and the air smelled of pine resin and old wood smoke. Luke set the trunk down near the table. He closed the door, shutting out the wind and the eyes of the town. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't the hostile silence of the street. It was the awkward, charged silence of 2 people who had just crossed a line from which there was no return. Ada stood by the stove, hugging her arms. She was acutely aware of the single bed. She was aware of the mud on her dress and the way the cabin felt suddenly very small, with Luke's broad shoulders filling the space. She started, then stopped. "I do not know what to say. You saved me again." Luke was busy lighting the fire in the stove. He kept his back to her, giving her privacy. "No saving," he said gruffly. "Just balancing the scales." He stood up and turned around. He looked at the bed, then at her. "You take the bed," he said. He pointed to a rolled-up bundle of blankets in the corner. "I have slept on hard ground more nights than soft. The floor suits me fine." "Luke, no," Ada protested. "It is your home. I cannot take your bed." "You can, and you will," Luke said. His tone allowed no argument. "I sleep by the door anyway. Old habit." He moved around the small space with a careful, deliberate slowness. He poured water from a bucket into a kettle and set it on the stove. When he passed her to get the coffee tin, he gave her a wide berth, asking, "Excuse me," before stepping within 3 feet of her. It was a politeness she hadn't expected. After Pike, after the drifters, after Silas, she expected men to take up all the air in a room. She expected to be crowded. But Luke treated the space around her as sacred ground. "Wash up," he said, nodding to the basin. "I will go tend the horses." He left her alone. Ada sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning under her weight. She buried her face in her hands and finally, safe within these 4 rough walls, she wept. 2 days later, the weather turned. It wasn't just a storm. It was a hammer blow from the north. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. The sky turned a bruising shade of charcoal, and the wind began to scream, stripping the last dead leaves from the aspens. By nightfall, sleet was hammering against the roof like handfuls of gravel. The wind found every chink in the logs, whistling through the gaps with a high, mournful note. The cabin grew cold. The little stove roared, glowing red at the belly, but the heat was sucked away the moment it drifted more than a few feet from the iron. Ada lay in the bed, buried under 3 quilts, wearing her wool dress and her coat. She was still shivering. Her teeth chattered with a rhythmic clicking sound she couldn't stop. On the floor near the door, Luke was wrapped in his bedroll and a thin horse blanket. He lay still, but she could hear the slight catch in his breath every time the wind gusted. The fire burned down to embers around midnight. The cold deepened, becoming a physical pain. Ada woke from a fitful doze, her body shaking so hard the bed frame rattled. She curled into a tight ball, trying to preserve her core heat. But it wasn't enough. The cold was a predator, gnawing at her toes and fingers. "Ada," Luke's voice came from the dark. It was tight with cold. Yes," she stammered. "The wood is low," he said. "If I go out to the pile now, I will let in more cold than I bring back." I am fine," she lied. "You are rattling the floorboards," Luke said. There was a pause. "We are going to freeze if we stay separate." Ada went still. The implication hung in the frozen air. "Come down here," Luke said, "or I can come up there, for warmth. That is all. Your choice." He didn't move. He waited. Ada lay there, listening to the wind scream. She thought of Silas. She thought of the fear of touch, but then she thought of Luke's hands on the cinch, his back to her while she washed, the way he had slept on the floor without a complaint. "Come up here," she whispered. "The floor is too cold." She heard him move, the rustle of blankets. He stood up, a dark shape in the gloom. He didn't rush. He sat on the edge of the bed first, letting her adjust to his weight. "I am keeping my boots on," he said softly, "just in case." He lay down on top of the covers at first, but the cold was too biting. "Under," Ada said. She lifted the heavy quilts. Luke slid in beside her. He was shivering too. His body was a large, solid mass of cold radiating against her side. He lay stiffly on the very edge of the mattress, his back to her, giving her as much room as the narrow cot allowed. "Better?" he asked. "A little," she said. They lay like that for an hour, rigid, separated by inches of cold air. But exhaustion and the biting temperature slowly wore down the walls. Ada shifted, seeking the heat. Her back brushed against his spine. He flinched, then settled, slowly, carefully. They turned. They ended up facing each other, bodies curved together in the dark. Ada tucked her head under his chin. Luke's arm came up, hesitating, then draped over her waist, pulling her closer to share the warmth. The heat generated between them was intoxicating. It wasn't just physical. It was an anchor in the storm. Ada listened to his heart. It was beating slow and steady, a heavy drum against her ear. "Thump, thump, thump, thump. Your heart is slow," she murmured, hard to scare it anymore. Luke whispered back. His hand on her waist moved slightly, his thumb brushing the rough wool of her coat. "Are you warm enough?" "Getting there," she said. Her hand found his free hand in the darkness, her fingers entwined with his. His grip was rough, calloused, but careful. "Luke?" "Yeah." "Why did you leave the South?" she asked. "Really?" The wind howled, rattling the door latch. "I had a brother," Luke said. His voice was low, vibrating in his chest against her cheek. "Caleb. He was wilder than me, younger." He paused, and for a moment Ada thought he wouldn't continue. "We were in a saloon in Abilene." Luke said, "I was drinking. I got into it with a drover over a card. Started a fight. Just fists. I thought, but the drover had friends. Caleb jumped in to help me. Luke's hand tightened on hers. One of them pulled a knife. Caleb took it in the gut. I killed the man who did it, but Caleb died on the floor while I was trying to stop the bleeding. Ada squeezed his hand. It wasn't your fault. I started the fight, Luke said starkly. I brought the danger. I have spent 10 years thinking that if I care about someone, I just end up getting them hurt. That is why I stay alone. That is why I ride the lines. You are not hurting me, Ada whispered. You are the only thing keeping me alive. For now, Luke said. But Brant is coming. I can feel it. Let him come, Ada said, and she meant it. She shifted, lifting her head to look at him in the dark. She could just make out the outline of his face, the shadow of his scar. Silas made me feel small, she confessed. He made me feel like I was just a thing, a doll he could break and throw away. He took my voice. He made me think I was dirty. You are not dirty, Luke said fiercely. You are iron, Ada. You are the finest thing I have ever known. The words broke something open inside her. The last dam holding back the floodwaters of her own desire gave way. She moved her hand from his grip and placed it on his chest, right over his heart. Make me feel real, she whispered. Please. She leaned up and kissed him. This time, there was no memory of Silas. There was only the smell of wood smoke and Luke. The kiss was slow, searching. Luke lay still, letting her set the pace. She pressed closer. She felt his breath hitch. Ada, he warned, his voice rough. If we do this, I am choosing, she said. She took his hand and guided it to her waist, pressing it firm against her. I am choosing you. Luke groaned low in his throat. He shifted, pulling her flush against him. His hands, so gentle with the horses, so deadly with a rifle, touched her with a reverence that made her throat ache. They moved slowly. Every layer of clothing removed was a question asked and answered. When her breath hitched in panic for a split second, Luke stopped instantly, freezing until she whispered, It is okay. Keep going. It wasn't perfect. There were tears, hers, and perhaps his, lost in the dark. There were moments of awkwardness, limbs tangled in heavy quilts, but it was theirs. When he finally moved inside her, she did not feel conquered. She felt found. She met his rhythm, her hands gripping his scarred shoulders, reclaiming the territory of her own skin. She realized, with a jolt of fierce joy, that dignity wasn't something Silas had stolen. It was something she was rebuilding, right here, in the dark, with a man who asked permission before he dared to love her. Morning came with a silence so profound it rang in the ears. The storm had passed. Sunlight, brilliant and blinding, streamed through the frost-rimed window. Ada woke first. She was warm. Luke's arm was heavy across her stomach. His face was buried in the curve of her neck. They were tangled together under the quilt, skin to skin. For a heartbeat. The old fear fluttered in her chest. What have I done? I am ruined now. Truly ruined. Then Luke shifted. He woke instantly, as men who live by the gun do. He lifted his head, blinking against the light. He looked at her. There was no shame in his eyes, no triumphant smirk of conquest. He looked at her with a quiet, stunned awe, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real, or that she was still there. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Morning, he rasped. Morning, Ada whispered. You okay? Yes, she said, and found that it was true. I am okay. Luke pulled her closer, kissing her forehead. I am not going anywhere. Ada, whatever comes up that road today, I am standing right here. It was a vow, simple as bread, solid as rock. Ada rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She felt strong. She felt ready. They spent the morning quietly. Ada cooked biscuits on the stove. Luke cleaned his rifle. The domesticity of it felt stolen, fragile, and incredibly sweet. By early afternoon, the wind shifted. Luke smelled it first. He stood up from the table, his head cocked. Smoke, he said. He went to the door and threw it open. Below them, in the valley, a black plume was rising from the town. It wasn't a chimney fire. It was thick, oily smoke, billowing up from the east end of the street. "The livery," Luke said grimly. "The livery is burning." Ada joined him at the door, clutching her shawl. "Why? An accident?" "Brant does not do accidents," Luke said. He reached for his rifle, checking the load. "He is smoking out the rats." The embers from the fire were catching the wind, drifting up the canyon walls toward the ridge. The air grew hazy. Then, through the shifting veil of smoke, they saw them, riders, a dozen of them. They were coming up the switchback trail that led to the cabin. At the head of the column rode a man on a massive black stallion. He wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, even from this distance. Ada knew the set of his shoulders. She knew the way he held the reins. "Silas," she breathed. Luke stepped out onto the porch. He jacked around into the chamber of his Winchester with a loud, metallic clack. "Go inside, Ada," he said, his voice flat and deadly. "No," Ada said. She stepped out beside him, her hand going to the pocket where the small Colt rested. Her legs were shaking, but her feet were planted. "He came for his property," she said. "He is going to find a woman." Luke looked at her. He saw the terror in her face, but he also saw the steel. He nodded once. "All right," he said. "We stand together." Silas Brant crested the ridge, his men fanning out behind him. He pulled his horse up 20 yards from the cabin, the smoke swirling around him like a cloak. He looked at Luke, he looked at Ada, and he smiled. A cold, terrible expression that promised nothing but pain. "Well," Silas called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "I see you have kept her warm for me. Carver, now, hand over what is mine, and I might just let you die quick." Silas Brant swung down from his saddle with the slow, heavy grace of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He did not look at the rifle in Luke's hands. He did not look at the wind-scoured logs of the cabin or the smoke drifting up from the burning livery in the valley below. He looked only at Ada. He adjusted the cuffs of his coat, brushing away invisible dust. He took a step forward, his spurs chiming with a silver, musical note that sounded obscenely cheerful against the backdrop of the smoldering fire. "Ada," Silas said. His voice was warm, almost fatherly, the tone of a man forgiving a foolish child who had stayed out past supper. "You look tired, my dear, and thin. This northern air does not suit you." Ada felt the old terror rise in her throat like bile. It was a physical reaction, hardwired into her nerves. Her stomach cramped, and her knees felt like water. The sound of his voice, that cultured, reasonable baritone, stripped away the last few months of freedom and put her right back in the parlor of the big house, with the velvet drapes drawn and the door locked. She wanted to shrink. She wanted to hide behind Luke. Her body screamed at her to lower her eyes, to apologize, to do whatever it took to stop the inevitable pain. But she did not move. She felt the heavy weight of the Colt in her pocket. She felt the ghost of Luke's warmth against her side from the night before. "I am not coming with you, Silas," she said. Her voice shook, but the words were audible. Silas smiled, a thin stretching of lips that did not reach his eyes. "Of course you are. We have worried about you. You ran off in such a state, deluded by grief and confusion. A woman in your condition? Well, it is not safe for you to be wandering the wilderness." He took another step, ignoring the line of gravel that marked the edge of the porch. "Step back." The command came from Luke. It sounded like gravel crunching under a boot heel. Silas stopped then. He turned his head slowly, finally acknowledging the man standing beside Ada. He looked Luke up and down, taking in the scarred face, the worn duster, the way Luke held the Winchester not as a threat but as a promise. Recognition dawned in Silas's eyes. It was not fear. It was a flicker of amused contempt. "I know you," Silas said. "You are the hand who broke my foreman's jaw 5 years ago. Carver, that is the name. The drifter with the bleeding heart." "You are trespassing, Brant," Luke said. "Turn your horse around." Silas chuckled, a dry sound. "I am recovering stolen property. Carver, and you're standing in my way. Again, I should have had you hung for assault back in New Mexico. It seems I was too lenient. You were busy beating a boy half to death, Luke replied, his voice flat. I reckon you did not have the time. Silas's face hardened. The mask of civility slipped, revealing the predator beneath. I have a legal right to this woman. She is under contract to my household. She owes a debt to my estate for her father's funeral and her own keep. She is a thief who stole silver from my desk and ran off to play whore in a mining town. Liar! Ada shouted. The injustice burned hot enough to sear through her fear. I worked for every scrap of bread you gave me, and the silver was my mother's locket that you took. See? Silas said, gesturing to his men. Hysterical. She is not in her right mind. He looked back at Luke. You are harboring a criminal, Carver, a thief and a liar. Now, step aside, or my men will remove you. Behind Silas, the dozen riders shifted. Hands dropped to holsters. The leather creaked. The threat was plain. 12 guns against 1 rifle. Luke did not flinch. He did not look at the men. He kept his eyes locked on Silas's throat. She is not going, Luke said. And if you take one more step toward this porch, I will put a bullet in your chest before your men can clear leather. You might kill me, Brant, but you will not live to see me hit the ground. The air crackled. The wind whipped between them, carrying the scent of burning wood. It was a standoff teetering on the edge of a massacre. Silas studied Luke. He saw the stillness in the cowboy's frame. He saw the finger resting on the trigger of the Winchester. Silas was a gambler, but he was a gambler who only bet on sure things. He realized that Luke Carver meant exactly what he said. Silas smiled again, cold and tight. He raised a hand, signaling his men to hold. You always were a brute. Carver, Silas said, preferring violence to reason. But we are civilized men, are we not? I do not need to shed blood to get what is mine. He gathered his reins, the black stallion tossing its head. I will go down to this charming little hamlet, Silas announced, looking at Ada. I will find the local magistrate. I will present my papers, the contract of indenture you signed. Ada, or have you forgotten the paper you signed when you were grieving your father? I will bring the law up here, and when I do, Mr. Carver will not just be a dead man, he will be a hanged man, a criminal resisting arrest. He wheeled his horse around. I will be back by sunset, Silas called over his shoulder. Have her bags packed. He kicked his horse into a gallop, his men thundering after him down the ridge trail, leaving Ada and Luke standing in the sudden, ringing silence. Luke lowered the rifle slowly. He watched the dust settle on the trail. He has papers, Ada whispered. She felt sick. I signed something. After Papa died, Silas put a paper in front of me. He said it was for the undertaker. I did not read it. I was crying too hard. Luke turned to her. His face was grim. He tricked you. It is an old game. If he brings the sheriff. If he brings a judge. Ada's hands were shaking. You cannot fight the law. Luke, they will hang you. Silas Brant is not the law, Luke said. He just pays for the badge. He walked into the cabin and began shoving supplies into a saddlebag. We cannot wait for him to come back. And we cannot run, if we run now. With him having papers, he will put a bounty on us. We will be hunted from here to the Pacific. Then what do we do? Ada asked. Luke stopped. He looked at her, then out the window at the vast, indifferent landscape. We find out just how strong his grip is, Luke said. Silas has been buying up this valley for months. He has been squeezing people. I reckon there are folks out there who are tired of being squeezed. We need witnesses. Ada, we need to show this town that he is not a king. They are afraid, Ada said. They won't speak. Maybe, Luke said, buckling the bag. But fear breaks 2 ways. Sometimes it makes you run. Sometimes it makes you fight. We have to see which way the wind is blowing. They rode out 20 minutes later, taking the back trails through the scrub oak to avoid the main road. They headed for the scattered homesteads that dotted the valley floor, the people who, like them, were barely hanging on. The first stop was the Jensen place. It was a miserable scrap of land with a dugout sod house and a few skinny cows. Mr. Jensen met them at the gate with a shotgun. He looked terrified. When Luke asked him about Brant, the old man spat on the ground but refused to look them in the eye. "He controls the water rights," Jensen muttered, looking over his shoulder as if the sagebrush had ears. "He dammed the creek 3 miles up. My cows are drinking mud. But if I complain, he says he will cut the fence. I got nothing to say to you folks. Go on. Get." They rode on. The story was the same at the Miller Ranch. Brant had cheated them on the weight of their beef at the railhead, claiming the scales were broken, paying them half what the herd was worth. But when Luke asked Mrs. Miller to stand with them, she just pulled her children close and shook her head, tears in her eyes. "He has men," she whispered. "Rough men. They burned the terrified livery today. Everyone knows it. If we speak against him, our barn will be next." It was disheartening. The shadow of Silas Brant lay heavy over the land, a suffocating blanket of debt and intimidation. Their last stop was a small shack near the creek bed, home to a washerwoman named Mrs. Galloway. She was a hard woman with hands like twisted roots. She didn't turn them away. She invited them in for bitter coffee. When Ada told her story, haltingly, skipping the worst parts, Mrs. Galloway stared into her cup for a long time. "My niece." "Mrs." Galloway said finally. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering on stone. "Mary. She worked at the big house for a season 2 years back. A pretty girl, laughing all the time." Ada held her breath. "She came home one night with her dress torn. Mrs." Galloway said, looking up with eyes that burned. "Crying. Said the boss man had cornered her in the pantry. Said he wouldn't let her leave until she—" The old woman's hand shook, rattling the cup. "She wouldn't go back. 2 days later, she went to the well and never came back. Sheriff said she must have run off with a peddler. But Mary didn't take her shoes. She didn't take her bonnet. Mrs." Galloway looked at Ada. "I know what he is. We all know, but knowing and saying are 2 different things." "If we stand," Ada said, leaning forward. "Will you stand with us? If I speak the truth in front of the town? Will you say what happened to Mary?" "Mrs." Galloway looked at the door. She looked at her gnarled hands. "I am old," she said. "I got nothing left to lose but this shack, and it leaks anyway." She nodded slowly. "If you speak, I will nod my head. That is all I can promise." It wasn't much, a nod, a whisper, but it was a crack in the wall. The sun was setting when they rode back toward Perdition Creek. The sky was a bruised purple, the smoke from the livery fire still hanging low over the town like a shroud. As they neared the main street, they saw the horses tied outside the Lucky Dollar. Silas's black stallion was there, and beside it, a government horse with the seal of the territory on the saddlebag. "He brought a deputy," Luke said, watching the saloon doors. "Not the local sheriff, someone with jurisdiction. He is going to arrest me," Ada said. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trying to escape the cage. Luke reached over and squeezed her hand. His grip was warm and rough. "Only if we let him," Luke said. "We walk in there. We face him. We tell the truth. If the town sees us standing, maybe they will remember they have spines." "And if they don't?" Ada asked. Luke checked the load in his revolver. He loosened the Winchester in its scabbard but left it on the saddle. He pulled the small Colt from his pocket and handed it to her. "Put this in your pocket," he said. "If they don't, we go down swinging." They dismounted. They tied the horses. Ada smoothed her skirts. She touched her hair. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window of the general store. She looked tired. She looked dusty. But she did not look like a victim. "Ready?" Luke asked. "No," Ada said. She took a deep breath of the smoky air. "Let us go." The saloon was packed. Every chair was taken, and men stood 3 deep at the bar. The air was thick with tension, heavy and suffocating. Silas Brant stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Beside him stood a man with a tin star on his chest, not the local deputy, but a marshal's deputy from the county seat. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. Harlan Pike was behind the bar, looking nervous. The usual noise of the saloon, the piano, the laughter, was gone. The silence was absolute. The swinging doors groaned open, Ada and Luke walked in. They brought the dust of the road with them. They walked side by side, not touching, but moving with a synchronized rhythm that spoke of a deep, unspoken bond. Heads turned. The crowd parted, creating a corridor down the center of the room. Silas turned. He smiled. "Right on time," Silas said. "I admire punctuality in a servant." He gestured to the deputy. "Marshal, this is the woman, Ada Thorne, and the man harboring her, Luke Carver." The deputy stepped forward. He looked soft, a man who spent more time behind a desk than in a saddle. "Ada Thorne," he announced, reading from the paper. "I have a warrant here for your arrest, breach of contract, theft of property, and solicitation." A murmur ran through the room. Solicitation. The word hung in the air, ugly and condemning. "You are to come with us to the county seat for trial," the deputy said. "If you resist, we are authorized to use force." Ada's hands started to tremble. She felt the eyes of the town on her, the judgment, the prurient curiosity. She felt the urge to run, to scream, to collapse. Luke's hand brushed hers, a quick, hard squeeze. Then he let go. He stepped back half a pace, giving her the floor. He was telling her, "This is your ground. Take it." Ada took a breath. She looked at the deputy. She looked at Silas. Then she turned and looked at the crowd. She saw Mrs. Webb. She saw the blacksmith. She saw Mrs. Galloway sitting in the corner, clutching her shawl. "I did not steal anything," Ada said. Her voice was quiet at first, shaking. "Speak up," Silas barked. "We cannot hear your lies." Ada's chin came up. She found the anger she had discovered on the shooting range, the cold, hard steel in her spine. "I said I did not steal anything," she shouted. The room flinched. "The only thing I took was my life," Ada said, her voice ringing clear now. "Silas Brandt claims I owe him." "He claims I signed a contract. I signed a paper because he told me it was to bury my father. He used my grief to buy me like a broodmare." She pointed a shaking finger at Silas. "He told you he protected me," she said, addressing the room. "He told you I seduced him. But look at him. He is a wealthy man. He is powerful. I was 18. I had no money. I had no family. Why would I choose to be used?" "She is lying," Silas snarled, his smile vanishing. "She is a whore who got caught." "He came into my room," Ada yelled over him. "He had a key. He told me that if I screamed, no one would help me because he owned the sheriff. He told me that my name was worth nothing against his gold." She ripped the collar of her dress down an inch, revealing the faint, jagged scar on her neck where the rope had burned her months ago. "He roped me," she cried, "like a calf. When I tried to run the first time, he dragged me back across the yard. Look at this. This is his mark." The room shifted. Men leaned forward. The barmaid stopped wiping glasses. The brutality of the image, a woman roped like cattle, cut through the abstract idea of contract dispute. "He is doing it to you too," Ada said, turning to the crowd. "He cheats the scales at the Circle M. He dammed the creek to starve the Jensen place. He hurts anyone who is smaller than him because he thinks he is God in this valley." She looked at Mrs. Galloway. "Ask her," Ada pleaded. "Ask her about Mary. Ask her why Mary never came home." Mrs. Galloway stood up. Her chair scraped loud on the floorboards. "She is telling the truth," the old woman said, her voice cracking. "Mary didn't run. He took her. He took her like he tried to take this girl." "Silence!" Silas roared. He slammed his glass down on the bar. It shattered. "This is a court of law, not a sewing circle. Marshal, arrest her! Arrest her now!" The deputy hesitated. He looked at the crowd. The faces that had been fearful were now angry. The mood in the room had turned. It was no longer a mob mocking a fallen woman. It was a town realizing they were all wearing the same collar. "Mr. Brandt," the deputy said nervously, "perhaps we should discuss this outside. The crowd is nothing," Silas spat. "They are sheep." He looked at the faces around him, the blacksmith gripping a heavy iron poker, the drifters shifting their hands to their belts. He saw his control slipping. He saw the illusion of his benevolence shattering under the weight of Ada's truth, and he saw Luke Carver standing there, watching him with eyes like gray stones. It was Carver's fault. Carver had given her the spine. Carver had brought her back. Silas made a calculation. If he killed the cowboy, claimed self-defense, said the man went for a gun, the girl would break, the town would scatter, fear would return. Silas's hand moved. It was a blur of motion. He swept his coat back and drew the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. "Ah, look out!" a man shouted. Silas wasn't aiming at Ada. He leveled the gun at Luke's chest. Time seemed to stretch and warp, slowing down to the heavy thud of a heartbeat. Luke saw the move. He reached for his own gun, his hand diving for the holster, but he was a fraction of a second behind. He had been watching the deputy, not expecting Silas to be foolish enough to draw in a crowded room. Ada saw it all. She saw the glint of the nickel plating on Silas's gun. She saw the murderous intent in his eyes. She was standing 3 feet from the door, propped against the frame, where Luke had left it to keep his hands free. Was the Winchester rifle. If he took your dignity, take it back. The words echoed in her mind, not as a memory, but as a command. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She moved on instinct, fueled by months of fear and hours of practice in the freezing dawn. Ada lunged. She grabbed the cold barrel of the rifle. She swung it up, the stock hitting her shoulder. It was heavy, but her arms were strong from scrubbing floors and hauling water. She didn't aim for a target. She aimed for the man. "Silas!" she screamed. The sound tore through the room. Silas flinched. He turned toward the scream, the gun in his hand wavering away from Luke, swinging toward her. Ada squeezed the trigger. Boom! The sound was thunder in a box. The muzzle flash blinded her for a second. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, bruising the bone, but she didn't step back. The heavy .44 caliber slug hit Silas Brandt high in the right side, just below the collarbone. The impact lifted him off his feet. He spun around, his gun flying from his hand to skid across the floor. He crashed into a poker table, sending chips and cards flying in a chaotic rain, and hit the sawdust with a wet thud. The silence that followed was deafening. Smoke drifted lazily from the barrel of the rifle in Ada's hands. Dust rained down from the ceiling rafters. Silas groaned, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his fingers, dark and fast. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't rising. "Don't move!" Luke was there instantly. His revolver was out, leveled not at Silas, but at the 2 hired men who had started to reach for their weapons. "Drop them," Luke ordered. "Now!" The hired men looked at Silas bleeding on the floor. They looked at Luke's steady aim. And they looked at Ada, who was working the lever of the rifle, ejecting the spent shell and chambering a fresh round with a mechanical, terrifying precision. They raised their hands slowly. "It is over," the blacksmith said, stepping forward with the iron poker in his hand. He stood beside Luke. Misses. Webb stood up. Then the baker. Then the drovers. One by one, the town closed ranks. They turned their backs on the man on the floor and faced his hired guns. The deputy looked at the wall of people. He looked at Ada, who stood with the rifle aimed at Silas's heart, her face streaked with tears and dust, looking like an avenging angel. The deputy swallowed hard. He realized which way the wind was blowing. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Silas Brandt," the deputy said, his voice trembling slightly as he walked over to the fallen cattle baron. "You are under arrest for the attempted murder of Luke Carver." Silas gasped, pain twisting his face. "You work for me," he wheezed. "Not anymore," the deputy said, snapping the cuffs on Silas's good wrist and dragging him up. "I reckon your credit just ran out." Ada lowered the rifle. Her arms began to shake. The adrenaline crashed, leaving her lightheaded. She felt a hand on her shoulder, solid, warm. "You took it back," Luke whispered in her ear. Ada looked down at the man who had terrorized her life. He looked small now, broken, just a man bleeding on a dirty floor. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I did." The wagon that carried Silas Brandt away from Perdition Creek did not look like the carriage of a king. It was a dusty, reinforced transport used by the county marshal, with iron bars on the small rear window, and mud caked thick on the wheels. Silas sat inside, his shoulder bandaged and his arm in a sling, his face pale from blood loss and a fury that burned colder than the winter wind. He did not look back at the town he had treated as his personal fiefdom. He stared straight ahead at the back of the deputy's head, plotting his return, calculating which judges owed him favors and which lawyers could twist the truth until it looked like justice. The trial, held 3 months later in the county seat, was a spectacle. It was messy, loud, and imperfect, just like the frontier itself. Silas's money bought him high-priced defenders who argued that Ada was hysterical, that Luke was a violent drifter, and that Silas had merely been trying to reclaim a contract servant. In the end, the law proved to be a fluid thing. The charge of attempted murder was reduced to assault with a deadly weapon. The kidnapping charges were dismissed for lack of concrete evidence. Silas Brandt did not hang. He did not rot in a dark cell for the rest of his days. He paid a staggering fine, served 6 months in a minimum security facility where he played poker with the warden, and was released. But while the law had failed to deliver a killing blow, the truth Ada had spoken in the Lucky Dollar Saloon had done damage that no amount of gold could repair. The story of Mary, corroborated by Mrs. Galloway's weeping testimony, had shattered his reputation. The banks in Denver, hearing of his instability and the growing unrest in the valley, pulled his lines of credit. His political friends, sensing a shift in the wind, stopped answering his telegrams. Silas Brandt returned to his ranch a diminished man, ruling over a shrinking empire of dust and resentment. His hold on the throat of Perdition Creek was broken, his fingers pried loose one by one. In the immediate aftermath, however, the victory felt fragile to Ada. The town was confused. They had seen a woman shoot a man, an act that violated every unwritten rule of their world. As Ada walked the streets in the days following the shooting, gathering supplies to leave, she felt the town splinter around her. "She asked for trouble," the blacksmith's wife muttered as Ada passed the livery, which was now nothing but charred beams and ash. "A woman who handles a gun like that has no business calling herself a lady. She should have kept quiet and done her duty. Trouble follows her," a drover whispered in the general store. "Brandt might be gone, but who is to say she won't turn that rifle on one of us next time she feels slighted?" But there were others. One morning, Ada found a loaf of fresh bread wrapped in a clean cloth sitting on the porch of Luke's cabin. There was no note, but she recognized the baking style of the baker's wife, a woman who had walked with a limp for years and never spoke of how she got it. Another day, as Ada was buying nails, Mrs. Galloway walked up to her. The old woman did not smile. She simply reached out, gripped Ada's hand with fingers like twisted roots, and nodded once. It was a silent transfer of strength, an acknowledgement that the ghost of Mary had finally been allowed to rest. "We cannot stay here," Luke said one evening, looking down at the lights of the town. "The air is too thick with old ghosts. We need our own ground." Ada agreed. They packed the pack mare, saddled their horses, and rode out of Perdition Creek without a backward glance. They found the valley 3 days later. It was a narrow slash of green tucked between 2 towering ridges of red rock, fed by a thin, determined creek that cut through willows and sharp stones. It was not easy land. It was rocky, stubborn, and wild, but it had good water and a stand of pine trees that had survived the wind. "Here," Luke said, reining in his horse. He looked at Ada. "It will be hard work, harder than anything we have done." "I am not afraid of work," Ada said, looking at the wild grass bending in the breeze. "I am only afraid of cages." They claimed the land not with paper, but with sweat. The building of the cabin was a grueling, bone-breaking labor that stretched over months. Luke felled the trees, his axe ringing in the silence of the valley like a church bell. Ada stripped the bark, her hands blistering and bleeding until calluses formed over the raw skin, hard as leather. They hauled the logs together, straining against ropes, their boots slipping in the mud. They mixed clay and straw to chink the gaps. their fingers caked with the earth they were trying to tame. They worked from sunrise until the moon was high and white, falling into their bedrolls too exhausted to speak, too tired to dream. But slowly, painfully, a home rose from the ground. It was not a palace. It was a single room with a loft, a stone chimney, and a porch facing the sunrise. But it was theirs. Every log was a testament to their choice to survive. The West, however, did not offer truces. It only offered challenges. That first spring, the creek swelled with snowmelt. Ada woke one morning to the sound of rushing water and stepped off the porch into ankle-deep mud. Their half-built root cellar was flooded, their winter store of potatoes ruining in the muck. They spent 2 days in the freezing water, bailing with buckets, shivering until their lips were blue, fighting to save enough food to keep them from starving. Summer brought a drought that turned the grass to tinder. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the valley until the air shimmered with heat. The creek dwindled to a trickle. They had to ration every bucket of water, prioritizing the horses and the small garden Ada had planted over their own thirst. They watched the sky for clouds that never came, their skin turning brown and dry as old parchment. Winter was the hardest. The snow came early and stayed late, piling up against the cabin door in drifts 10 feet high. The wind howled for days on end, a banshee screaming around the corners of the house. They were trapped inside, the world reduced to the circle of light cast by the oil lamp. They had to dig a tunnel through the snow just to reach the barn and feed the horses. Survival was not a guarantee. It was a daily choice, made over coffee that grew weaker as the supplies ran low. Made in the grim silence of checking the woodpile. Made in the determination to wake up one more morning and face the cold. Yet, in that crucible of hardship, they carved out moments of gentleness that felt all the more precious for their rarity. One evening in late autumn, after a day spent hauling firewood, Ada sat by the stove, too tired to unbraid her hair. Luke walked over to her. He did not speak. He simply took the pins from her hair, his rough, scarred fingers moving with a delicacy that always surprised her. He picked up the brush and began to pull it through her hair. Long, slow strokes. The rhythm was hypnotic. "You have gray coming in," Luke murmured, touching a strand near her temple. "The wind painted it there," Ada said, leaning back into his touch. "Does it bother you?" "No," Luke said. He bent down and kissed the top of her head. "It looks like silver. It looks like you earned it." On other nights, when the wind shook the walls, Ada would patch his torn shirts while Luke read aloud. He had found a tattered copy of a book of poetry in a box of supplies they had traded for. Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. Luke's voice was rough, shaped by years of shouting over cattle and wind. But when he read the words, they took on a cadence that was almost holy. "I have heard what the talkers were talking, the talk of the beginning and the end," he read, the firelight catching the gray in his own beard. "But I do not talk of the beginning or the end. There was never any more inception than there is now, nor any more youth or age than there is now." Ada would stop her stitching, listening to the words, watching the man who had once believed he was only made for violence, finding peace in the rhythm of language. Their physical love deepened, shedding the last vestiges of fear. It became a language of its own, spoken in the dark. There were nights when desire flared hot and urgent, born of the adrenaline of survival. One afternoon, a cougar had stalked their foal. Creeping down from the rocks, Luke had spotted it, grabbed his rifle, and fired a shot that missed by inches, sending the cat scrambling back up the cliff. The closeness of death, the realization of how easily their fragile life could be torn apart, had sent them rushing into the cabin, locking the door, and pulling each other close with a desperate, frantic hunger. They made love with a fierceness that left marks on their skin, clinging to each other as if to prove they were still warm, still alive, still there. But there were other nights, quiet nights, when tenderness ruled, nights when Luke would trace the line of her spine with his fingertips, moving so slowly it felt like he was memorizing her. Nights when Ada would kiss the scars on his knuckles, thanking his hands for the work they did. These were the nights when they did not need to speak, when the connection between them was a steady, flowing river. The trauma was not gone. It lived in the shadows, waiting. Ada still had nightmares. She would wake gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs, the taste of leather and dust in her mouth. In her dreams, she was back in the big house, or running through the sagebrush with Silas's laughter echoing in the canyon. Luke never tried to hush her. He never told her it was just a dream. He knew that for the dreamer. The terror is real. He would simply hold her. He would wrap his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest, becoming a solid wall between her and the dark. He would let her cry, let her shake, waiting until her breathing matched the slow, steady rhythm of his own. "I am here," he would whisper into her hair. "I have the watch. You are safe." In the quiet after the storm of panic passed, Ada would sometimes turn in his arms. She would initiate the closeness, guiding his hands, reclaiming her body over and over again. It was an act of defiance against the memory of Silas. "This is mine," her touch said. "This pleasure, this warmth, this choice, it belongs to me." Luke had his own ghosts. One night, sitting on the porch watching the rain, he grew silent and brooding. Ada knew that look. It was the look he wore when he thought about his brother. "Caleb, I should not have let you walk into that saloon," Luke said, his voice heavy. "I should have put you on a train. I let you stand in the line of fire. If he had been faster, if you had missed—" "Luke," Ada said. She put her hand on his arm, forcing him to look at her. "Stop. It is my job to protect you," Luke said. "I failed Caleb. I nearly failed you. You did not fail me," Ada said firmly. "You gave me the rifle. You taught me how to use it. And then you stepped back and let me save myself." She squeezed his arm. "If you had stood in front of me, if you had fought him for me, I would still be the victim. I would still be the woman who needed saving. But because you trusted me to pull the trigger, I am whole. Do you understand? I needed to be the one to stand between him and what I loved." Luke looked at her, the rain dripping from the eaves of the porch. He saw the steel in her eyes, the strength that had been forged in the fire of that day. "What you loved?" he asked softly. "I was not just defending myself, Luke," Ada said. "I was defending you. I was defending us." Slowly, the tension left Luke's shoulders. He covered her hand with his own. He was beginning to accept a new truth, that love was not about keeping someone out of the fight. It was about trusting that they were strong enough to stand beside you in it. Seasons turned. The willows along the creek grew thick and green. The foal grew into a sturdy mare. And slowly, the cabin in the valley became more than just a shelter. It became a beacon. The first to come was Mrs. Miller, the widow from the valley who had been too afraid to speak against Silas. Her landlord, emboldened by the vacuum of power Silas left behind, had raised her rent beyond reason. She showed up at Ada's door with 3 children and a wagon of meager belongings, eyes downcast in shame. Ada did not turn her away. She opened the door wide. "Put the kettle on," she told Luke. "We have guests." They stayed for 2 weeks until Luke helped Mrs. Miller negotiate a fair lease with a new landowner. Then came old Tom. He was a former hand for the Circle M, the man whose silence Luke had despised during the cattle drive. But Tom had been fired for being too slow, his leg crippled by a kick from a Mustang years ago. He was starving, drifting through the high country. Luke found him camping by the creek. He didn't offer charity. He offered a job. "I need someone to mend the tack and watch the garden," Luke said. "Pay is fair. Food is hot." Tom looked at Luke, then at his own crippled leg. "I ain't much use. Carver, I stood by when they cut your cinch." "The cinch is fixed," Luke said, "and the past is gone. Can you work leather?" "I can," Tom said. Tom moved into the loft of the barn. He became a fixture in the valley, his grumbling presence a strange comfort. He carved wooden toys for Mrs. Miller's children when they visited and taught Ada how to tell when a storm was coming by the ache in his knee. the valley filled with the sounds of life, the ring of the anvil, the laughter of children, the low murmur of conversation over supper. It was a hard life, but it was a good life. 2 years after the shooting, Ada saddled her horse. "I'm going to town," she told Luke. He looked up from the fence he was mending. He didn't ask why. He didn't offer to go with her. He simply nodded. "Ride careful." "I will be back by sunset," she said. The ride to Perdition Creek felt different this time. The wind was gentler, carrying the scent of pine instead of dust. The town looked smaller than she remembered. The buildings were still warped and gray, but they no longer looked like monsters. She rode past the saloon. It had a new sign, and the piano music drifting out sounded cheerful. She rode past the boarding house, where a new landlady was sweeping the porch. She did not stop. She rode through the town and up the winding trail to the hill that overlooked the valley. She dismounted and tied her horse to a scrub oak. She reached into her saddle scabbard and pulled out the Winchester rifle. It was clean, well-oiled. She had carried it every day for 2 years. It had been her third arm, her security, her voice. She walked to the edge of the hill. The town lay spread out below her, a collection of toys in the dirt. Ada held the rifle in her hands. She remembered the weight of it in the saloon. She remembered the recoil. She remembered the feeling of power. But as she stood there, with the wind tugging at her skirts, she realized something. The moment she had taken her dignity back wasn't when she pulled the trigger. The bullet had only stopped a man. Her dignity had returned the moment she stood in that room and spoke the truth. It had returned when she refused to let shame silence her. It had returned when she chose to love Luke, and more importantly, when she allowed herself to be loved by him, fully, without reservation, without apology. The rifle was just a tool. It was a symbol of the transition, a bridge she had crossed from victim to survivor. But she was no longer just a survivor. She was a woman who was building a life. She did not need the weight of it anymore to know who she was. She knelt down. She found a cleft in the rocks, a dry, sheltered place protected from the rain. She laid the rifle down. She placed a box of shells beside it. "For the next one who needs it," she whispered. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands. She felt lighter. The phantom rope that had lingered on her neck for so long finally dissolved into the air. She mounted her horse and turned its head toward the mountains, toward home. The sun was setting when she reached the valley. The sky was a masterpiece of the frontier, violent streaks of burnt orange and deep violet. The clouds edged in steel gray and gold. The light turned the creek to a ribbon of fire and cast long, purple shadows across the grass. Luke was on the porch. He was repairing a bridle, his hands working the leather with easy familiarity. He looked up as she rode in. He didn't speak until she had turned the horse into the corral and walked up the steps to stand beside him. He looked at her empty saddle scabbard. He looked at her face. "You leave it?" he asked. "I left it," Ada said. "Feel lighter?" "Yes," she said. "And heavier. It is harder to carry peace than a gun." "I think—" Luke set the bridle down. He stood up and leaned against the porch rail, looking out at the valley they had claimed from the wild. "Are you at peace now, Ada?" he asked. Ada looked at the jagged skyline. She looked at the scars on Luke's face, softened by the dying light. She thought of the nightmares that still came and the hard work waiting for them at dawn. She smiled faintly. "I do not know about peace," she said honestly. "The world is still hard. The wind still blows, but I know I'm exactly where I chose to be." Luke nodded. It was enough. He reached out and wrapped an arm around her waist. He pulled her close, her back against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. They stood there together, watching the colors fade from the sky. The air grew cold, but the warmth between them was steady, a banked fire that would last through the night. The hard world kept turning, indifferent to their struggles. But here, on this porch, in this valley, they had carved out a space where love was a choice, where dignity was a birthright, and where two broken people had fit their jagged edges together to make something whole. "Let us go inside," Luke whispered. "The coffee is hot." Yes, Ada said, turning in his arms to kiss him. Let us go home. Thank you, friends, for riding this trail with me. It has been a long journey from the dust of Perdition Creek to the quiet of this valley, and I am obliged to you for listening to the story of Ada and Luke. I would love to hear where you are listening from, whether you are watching the sunset in Arizona, drinking coffee in London, or somewhere in between. Please leave a comment and let me know. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. There are many more stories hidden in the sagebrush, waiting to be told. Until the next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.